Good late afternoon, everybody. We are thrilled to be here, and this is one of those occasions in our current situation where we're unable to meet in the physical space, but we are grateful for what we have at this moment in time, which is technology that can actually, in so many ways, bring us closer together globally. And today marks that kind of occasion. And our webinar today is a serious one. It's a serious subject, data surveillance in the age of viral pandemics. What does this mean for our communities? What does it mean for the technology? How is the technology unpacked? What are the ethical dimensions that underpin where this is all going? This is an event, a collaborative event between ALN Academy, Griffith University, the Commonwealth, Microsoft, and Strathmore University. And we've got together viewing this as a timely moment to bring these discussions to the fore and to do our best to share what the experts on our panel know in this particular dimension, and to really get a conversation developing, not just today. This is a 5-part series. We will be unpacking some of the questions that we pose in subsequent sessions. This is an ambitious session. There are over 20 experts who will be presenting over the course of the next 3 hours. And yeah, I'm thrilled to be able to introduce our first panel. Our first panel will be dealt with or moderated by Professor Roger Street from Oxford University. And before then, we will hand over to Professor Brendan McKay from Griffith University, who will further introduce the session and just deal with some of the issues before we set about with the program for today.
Thank you. I actually think Esther was scheduled to speak before I was.
Yes, welcome everyone. My name is Roger Street, as was just mentioned. I'm the moderator for this first track, and the first track is a fundamental track. It builds the foundation that we need, and it's to talk about what are the key drivers, or key factors driving infectious disease emergence in the 21st century. And we've got six speakers that we're going to provide an opportunity for them to present their thinking, present their ideas, present their questions, with the hope of maybe that we would stimulate the discussions after they've spoken, after the 6 speakers, but also that it would stimulate discussions for the deep dive that it was mentioned earlier that will occur for this track on the 9th of June. So to begin, I'm not going to take any more time than that, and I'm going to begin by going, first of all, to Esther Onyango from Griffith University. And Esther is, I welcome your talk, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Roger. Angelica, could you get the PowerPoint up, please?
Hi, Esther. Sure, the PowerPoint is on its way. It's taking a bit to load, so perhaps in the meantime you can let us know a bit about you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm really excited to be here to present on this topic, as it's something that's has interested me quite a bit in just understanding the interactions between diseases and how they spread. in linked systems. So mainly in biological, ecological, and socioeconomic systems, but particularly now with the current situations and the situation and the risk of increasing pandemics, how we can utilize new technologies like big data and artificial intelligence. So I'm excited to be part of this webinar series. And just to get started with the next slide, please. So a brief background before I get into actual drivers of disease. So just at a basic level, for disease to occur, 3 components need to happen. You need a host, which can be a human, an animal, or a vector, and you need a pathogen, which is the agent that causes disease that's going to infect that host. And the environment where this that allows that infection to occur. And these 3 components, the interaction between 3 components is what leads to disease. And the way I look at this is an integrated approach on how the biological, ecological, and socioeconomic environments influence the emergence, re-emergence, and spread of infectious diseases. So it's an approach that is interdisciplinary and takes different disciplines into account to understand the interactions between these drivers. So I will briefly go over why we need to consider these linked systems, why we need to understand the connections between these 3 foci and how they contribute to the disease. And then my fellow panelist members will go into a bit more detail about these drivers of the disease and how they actually influence disease spread. So in the next slide, I'll just illustrate that the complexity of these interactions so that I briefly just talked about in the slide before. And on your left-hand side is your ecological system, and on your right-hand side is the social system. And this goes from a scale from a global to micro level. And you have different drivers at those levels. So in your ecological, from your landscape level down to your organism, and in the social side from your society to your individual. And then you have your biological system interacting between that. And in between all of those different levels and the 2 different sides is a series of interactions that drivers of transmissions that interact to influence the spread of disease. And when you come down to your biological system, you can have diseases spread through either what are known as vector-borne diseases. So they're going to transmit through an insect vector, which can be a mosquito or a tick. So an example, malaria is a vector-borne disease. And then you have your zoonotic diseases. And generally these jump from animals to human, and very often as a result of our interaction with the environment. So the current COVID-19 is an example of one as well. And the transmission potential really on your vector-borne side depends on the abundance of the vector that you have, and also the potential for it to transmit disease. And on your zoonotic side, then it depends on how much of that zoonotic disease reservoir you have in the system, and also social interaction and connectivity. So it becomes really a complex system of interactions. And the next slide illustrates an example of these drivers that I'm talking about and where they sit within that disease triangle. So you have your biological, ecological, and socio-economic drivers, which are color-coded on there to show. And at the pathogen level, the things that you're looking at is if the pathogen can cause infection, if the infection then spreads to disease and how severe the disease is, and things like drug resistance, ability to avoid the immune response. And then you have your biological drivers in your hosts, such as age, sex, behavior, nutritional status, and so forth. And the environmental drivers as well, which can, and each of those can be a mix of ecological drivers and socioeconomic drivers. So risk of infection depends on how these drivers interact. You may not, you may have a pathogen, we may not necessarily proceed to disease, just dependent on how these drivers interact. And in my final slide, it just illustrates then how these drivers, if you're looking at it from integrated level, then you need to look at the exposure potential of these drivers, but also the vulnerability of systems to these drivers as well. And again, this can operate from a global to a local scale and from a macro to a micro scale as well. And I think that's a good point to then move on to Brendan Mackey, who's going to illustrate how one of these drivers, which is climate change, does influence the spread of disease. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. I'm now going to, as Esther just mentioned, would move on to Brendan Mackey, who is also at Griffith University. Brendan.
Thank you, Roger. And well, at least it's good evening for me, where I am speaking to you from Southeast Queensland, Australia. So if we could open the PowerPoint, please. And what I'm going to talk about is one set of drivers, which are the climatic drivers. And in particular, I want to talk about this in the context of global climate change. Next slide, please. Okay, we're having trouble with the, yeah, there we go. So I think most people, if not everyone, knows that our current understanding of how the climate change, how the global climate is changing, and the consequences of that for people and society and natural systems is the result of the synthesised reports and assessments of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we've had a number of reports come out in recent years: the 1.5 degree of global warming special report, oceans and cryosphere, climate change and land, and we're in the middle of the sixth assessment report, the large synthesis reports that are published every 7 years. And it's now been unequivocally established that climate change isn't something for the future. We are now living the impacts of one degree global warming. And if we go to the next slide, which is from the 1.5 degree report, which made clear to us that by about 2050, we're going to hit this benchmark or this threshold of about 1.5 degree of global warming above pre-industrial levels by about 2050, and maybe 30 to 50 years after that, we're on the path to exceed 3 degrees global warming. And that graph at the bottom is called a burning embers diagram. It illustrates the vertical axis. It illustrates the grey bar is like the impacts of 1 degree of global warming and 1.5 and 2 degree plus for different natural, managed and human systems. And we can see on the left-hand side that already with 1 degree of global warming, there are catastrophic consequences that exceed the adaptive capacity for tropical shallow reefs. And as global warming increases, increasingly different systems become more heavily impacted and their adaptive capacity is exceeded. So if we go to the next slide, that provides some context for thinking about how infectious diseases can be impacted by rapidly changing climate, both direct and indirect impacts. And of course, one of the main ones of those is rising temperatures, but there are also flow-on effects to the climate system, including shifting rainfall regimes and extreme climatic events. So we can see for something like vector-borne diseases that there are already and will be greater shifts in the distribution, including for some vectors an expansion of their range, and in some cases a very significant expansion of their range. There can be reduced incubation time for viruses. There can be increased bite rates. There can be enhanced infectivity. All of these can be major responses we see from rising temperatures and shifts in rainfall regimes. For foodborne diseases, again from higher temperatures or extreme climatic events, or shifting rainfall regimes. We can see an increased risk of food contamination and other responses, biological responses like increased rates of bacteria replication. Zoonotic diseases that Esther referred to, again, from rising temperatures and shifting rainfall regimes, we can see shifts in the range and density and movements of wildlife species, new human-wildlife contacts and exposure to novel diseases. And waterborne diseases as well, one of the consequences with higher temperatures, again, increased rates of bacterial replication, but also in some locations, reduced water supply and the impacts of extreme climatic events, which decrease the availability of clean water. So if we move to my final slide, how these actually result in infectious diseases, or if you like, the risk of infectious diseases, as Esther noted, that risk is a function of the nature of the climate hazard, the exposure of people to that hazard, and the vulnerability of communities and individuals. And these three risk factors vary depending on your geography and national circumstances, and in particular, your level of development and economic development. So thank you. I'll stop there and hand back to our chair, Roger.
Thank you very much, Brendan. I'm wondering whether Chris is with us. Is Christy Ebi with us?
No, she's struggling to get on the call. So what I suggest is we move on to the next, and then we'll try and get her in.
Okay, thank you very much. I was seeing some of the emails going on there, and I was wondering. Our next speaker is Musonda Momba, who is with UNEP in Kenya. Musamba?
Thank you very much, Roger. So I work for the United Nations Environment Programme here in Nairobi, where we are headquartered, the only UN agency headquartered in the South, and the agency that's responsible for environmental issues. So I'm responsible for the Terrestrial Ecosystems Programme of the agency, and I'm going to speak just really building on what the science, the info that's come in from both Esther and my colleague there. So what we've been doing as the United Nations is obviously convening governments through multilateral processes. And what does that mean? We bring governments together to have conversations mostly around the science and building the case in terms of the policies that are happening on the ground. So last year on the 1st of March 2019, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution entitled the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration 2021 through to 2030, aligning with the last 10 years of the Sustainable Development Goals. So if I can unpack that a little bit, I mean, the science is fine, intergovernmental panel on climate change, the intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So much has been generated, but what are the realities on the ground? The realities on the ground are that a lot of landscapes on this planet are degraded. And as such, and a lot of the landscapes that are remaining that need to be conserved are either threatened or actually endangered of losing the ecosystem services that they provide. So because of this particular resolution, it basically brought together constituencies, not just governments, but also scientists, young people. We had massive consultation, youth consultation globally, to really begin to think. And what is really wonderful about the UN resolution on the Decade for Ecosystem Restoration is that the word restoration comes after conservation, which means that it's implying and arguing for a case that we need to conserve the very ecosystems that we have, because there's no guarantee that what we destroy will recover. And as you can see from the graphs, in a 1.5 degree to 3 degree world, it's complicated. And as such, what we're trying to do really is to build a movement around the world. How do we build a movement bottom up to get, communities really being advised? Trees that could have grown, 50 years ago no longer grow due to high temperature dynamics in different landscapes. And it's not just about tree planting, and we hear a lot more young people saying, no, it's about tree growing, and what kind of species? Is it indigenous versus a non-indigenous species? So what we're trying to do as the United Nations is to really convene different constituencies and really bring on board different thinkers' minds, businesses. And as I keep seeing this on the internet now in some of the conversations I'm engaging in, building back better. I think we should build back greener, more and more. And I think that's coming up and emerging as a conversation. And so as a solution, how can people be engaged, be young people, you know, children in kindergarten, what can they help in sort of the restoration or the conservation agenda? How do we shift a mindset in a planet that is really in flux at the moment? And I think what COVID-19 has done is to show us that when we degrade our ecosystems, a classic case in point is that with zoonosis, a very good study here in Kenya has shown that with degradation of forests, we're seeing bats getting much closer and settling into cities and in buildings. And most of these bats are carrying coronaviruses. And I had a chat with scientists from Jomo Kenyatta University and the Kenya National Museums of Kenya that are doing, you know, basically putting microchips in bats. And these bats are flying all the way through Zambia, which is my native country, all the way to Congo DRC and back. So what are they bringing back? We don't know. And if they come back and find that a forest is degraded, they're going to perch themselves on your roof, and the droppings of the bats have got coronaviruses and many other viruses. That is a life in danger. And so we begin to see this connectivity. So I'd be more than happy to discuss really the realities of unpacking those multilateral and sort of complex processes into the doing. How can we do it? And as the SDGs say, let's not leave anyone behind. So here we are. Thank you so much. We can't hear you, Roger. I can't hear you.
I'm doing many things here because we were trying to get Chris into the into our panel, and they're still having difficulty, so I didn't realize. But thank you very much for your presentation. I think is Chris there yet? No. Okay. I think even though it'll now be a little bit out of order, but more out of order, I think it'd be useful to move on to Giovanni Brosat, who is with the coordinator of the wildlife and forestry crimes at UNODC and linkages with zoonotic diseases. Giovanni, it's over to you now.
Thank you, Roger. And well, UNODC is the United Nations office that deals mainly with issues related with drugs and crime. So it's no surprise that today I'm talking about crime as a main risk factor that may affect the emergence of new pandemic. Now, as we've seen with COVID-19, there has been a scenario that is at this point the most likely scenario connecting this pandemic to zoonoses, and in particular to the consumption of wild animals. Now, this has, in a sense, reignited a global debate on the trade and consumption of wildlife, with a debate that is quite complex, where different elements come into play, considerations about science and conservation and the socioeconomic impact on any decision on whether banning or regulating better the trade and the consumption of wildlife. Now, one area on which pretty much everybody agrees is the need of addressing the illegal wildlife trade, which has been expanding over the past decades without any interruption, basically, and which flourishes in the gray areas of the legal trade, partly because of an increased level of sophistication of the organized criminal groups that are responsible for moving wildlife from one country to another, from one continent to another. And these groups are more and more resembling traditional organized crime groups that operate in other crime areas. We have now these groups that manage to elude controls through the typical tools of organized crime: corruption, fraud, intimidation, violence, with a very strong logistical basis that allows to move wildlife from an ecosystem in one country to a market in an urban setting in a different continent. So this poses certainly completely different sets of risks. In a legal trade scenario, we have some degree, generally high degree of sanitary inspection on the goods that reach the markets. With illegal wildlife trade, these kind of sanitary controls are eluded, are escaped completely. This poses additional risks. When these products, wildlife products, reaches facilities in another continent, then the risks of a spillover of a virus, or a risk that is associated to wild animals that have virus mutations and spillover that cannot be entirely fully anticipated by science, then the risks of this facility is higher. And when I talk about this facility, I'm talking about markets that generally can sell only legal products, but may have a part of the market that deals with wild meat or illegal wild meat in some parts, wildlife facilities that can be also breeding facility, captive breeding facilities, or establishment that deal with traditional medicines, and they process wildlife products as part of medications. So in that context, we are confronted with a new set of risks driven by legal activities and by crime. So that's where actually a government at some point has to determine what is the cost that we need to undertake to reduce those risks. How can we maintain a legal trade while combating the illegal trade, and what needs to be put in place to really be effective in fighting illegal trades, if anything. And the cost can be new legislation, improved law enforcement, improved capacity to conduct inspections. So these are some costs the government has to calculate. Governments have to understand what are the risks and what are the costs related to reducing those risks, and based on that, making policy decisions that are based not only on environmental and health considerations, but also on rule of law and legality considerations. I stop here for now, and I'm happy to take other questions.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. We're still unable to bring in Chris, but we have, I think I'll move on to Louise now. Louise Hooper is a barrister at Garden Court Chambers in the UK. And I'll turn over to you, Louise.
Good afternoon from where I am, and thank you very much to the ALN for inviting me to this timely webinar, and it's a privilege to be part of this great panel of speakers. Global public health programmes and pandemics in particular, and our international response to them, give rise to a host of ethical, human rights, governance and legal questions that require an international rather than regional or local response, and that response has to be fair, just and enforceable. As a human rights lawyer, I am, unsurprisingly, a firm believer that adopting a human rights-based approach to most issues is the preferred option. On March the 27th, 1958, in a speech to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt asked, "Where, after all, do human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world." I question whether there are any such places left. In the light of things like Google Maps, not only can the places themselves be seen, but often blurred out pictures of the people who inhabit them. Human rights now begin on devices so small they can fit on a child's wrist. And whilst there remains a need to uphold them close to home, the larger world has become smaller, and the need for transnational cooperation and regulation probably ever greater. In the past, it's been said, if you have nothing to fear, you have nothing to hide. Increasingly, I feel if you have something to fear, you have nowhere to hide. In this time of the Internet of Things, overwhelming data collection, artificial intelligence and machine learning development in the pursuit of public health, epidemic prediction and life preservation, we need to consider what rights need protecting and what frameworks we have. Are they enforceable and sufficient? I mean, obviously, from an international legal human rights perspective, we have a series of well-known international instruments, including the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, conventions on the elimination of racial discrimination and all forms of discrimination against women, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which probably doesn't get the prominence that it deserves. Newer conventions embracing current challenges include the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and Convention on Biological Diversity and the Convention to Combat Desertification. In the specific context of pandemics, we have the International Health Regulations from 2005, representing an agreement between 196 countries, including all World Health Organization member states, to work together for global health security. Through these, countries agree to build their capacities to detect, assess and report public health events. The World Health Organization plays the coordinating role. Together with its partners, health countries build capacities. These regulations include specific measures at ports, airports and on the ground crossings to limit the spread of health risks to neighbouring countries and to prevent unwarranted travel and trade restrictions so that traffic and trade disruption is kept to a minimum. All of these international agreements are enforceable between states to greater or lesser degrees, and in some cases individual complaint mechanisms exist. Whilst I don't doubt the importance of these conventions, the process is often cumbersome and may simply not be quick enough to prevent harm as opposed to compensate for it after the event. That said, these international conventions, which have stood as quite well over time, are currently at risk in a global world where leaders refuse to cooperate or abide by the international institutions and are increasingly resorting to local populism, and the authority and effectiveness of these mechanisms is under threat. And that's not to mention any of the funding issues that go alongside of that. So at the risk of my presentation turning into a series of lists and bullet points, I aim to ask some questions. And this is in the context of what I expect you to be discussing over the next 3 sessions. What is being done or proposed, and what questions might we wish to ask about that in the context of data collection? Who's collecting the data? What's it being used for? Who is it controlled by? What analysis is being performed and how are we accounting for bias? If the data is skewed, it runs the risk of creating inaccurate results. And what happens if it's used to implement public policy and I feel I'm being unfairly treated? How do I challenge this? Secondly, what rights might be infringed by the processes and programmes that are being considered? So concerns arise in particular relating to the rights to privacy, security, freedom of movement, assembly, association, rights to health and equal treatment. Who holds the power? Because I think I might have dropped then, but so who holds the power? Because it's the body with power that has to be held to account, and this may impact on the mechanism used. So we have state powers versus the individual, but also commercial multinational powers, state versus state powers involved in things like cyber targeting, and malicious elements using systems to cause chaos or terror, for example, false reporting of health alerts to create lockdown situations. Fourthly, who's responsible for rectification and redress? So my concern is that in an age of the 4th and 5th industrial revolutions, to a certain extent, state abuse of power is becoming less relevant than private capitalist interests. We have multinational corporations that collect vast amounts of private data with limited emphasis on consent, who do not pay tax, who are not accountable in any meaningful way to either governments or public or international institutions, and the absence of any real international enforcement mechanism renders most concerns redundant. So my conclusion is that we all want to live disease-free, and technology can clearly help achieve that, but at what cost, and what are the rights involved? Where mass data is collected, in addition to providing positive public health benefits, it runs the risk of being used for a variety of nefarious purposes, which could include things like voter suppression, persecution of political dissidents, discriminatory resource allocation, denial of health insurance and therefore treatment, detention, and potentially forcible medical treatment. It's essential that those designing and implementing technological solutions are keenly aware of and guard against these potential risks. So the fundamental question I would urge people to keep in mind is, where do you draw the balance to ensure a public health rather than a public order or surveillance response to a public health crisis?
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask one more time to see is Chris with us?
Right, I actually do have an important announcement to make. What we need to do is, those who are not presenting as of now shouldn't be in as presenters. They should be in as attendees, and then we lift them into becoming presenters at the requisite time. So that apparently is causing some issue to our system. So can I kindly ask all who are not presenting at the moment, who will be coming on later, to vacate, and we'll have enough bandwidth to deal with it. And this is technology. We're moving into new spaces, so these things can happen. But hopefully we'll be able to get Chrissy on. And if we are unable to, we will be having a moderated session towards the end of today's proceedings, and most certainly we'll ask Chrissy to be on that if she's unable to quickly get on. I'm obviously conscious of time, so I hope you can bear with us. But Roger, perhaps in light of what has been discussed so far, you can kind of take some questions or kind of pose some points on your own volition until we hopefully get Chrissy in.
Okay, thank you. I've got a few minutes, I assume. Abdullah, have you sent me the questions?
Yes, I have. And
okay.
We only have one question.
Okay, well, I'll start with that one, and then there's a few questions I think one or two questions I'd be interested in getting a response from. The question we've received was particularly directed to Giovanni, and it's, what concrete steps can the international community take to disrupt the illegal wildlife trade?
Thank you. I mean, it's difficult to compress in 1 minute the work that I've been conducting essentially for the past 10 years. But there is an important element. This illegal wildlife trade is often still perceived as an environmental issue. And as I tried to explain before, we're now dealing with the type of reality that is resembling more and more the type of transnational crime that we know about, like drug trafficking or human trafficking, the same level of sophistication. So this kind of crime can certainly not be handled by environmental authorities. They require the inclusion, the contribution from the criminal justice system. That means also strengthening the capacity of government to investigate and prosecute criminal groups that operate across countries and across continents. It's the most simple case is the case of poaching in an African country and then moving goods through the oceans and then selling them in markets in Asia. That entails illegal activities happening in multiple countries, which can be responded to also only through cooperation among those governments. So there are, for instance, some conventions, in particular the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, that can help countries to work together to conduct joint investigations against criminal groups that operate across borders, across countries and across continent. So that's a way, a concrete way of law enforcement authorities to actually address this illegal wildlife trade.
Okay, thank you. One of the things that came across my desk this morning was a note from my Chinese colleagues, and it deals with rights and people's rights, and what has happened as a result of the coronavirus situation, particularly in China, that a significant number of people that rely on the raising and selling of wildlife for eating in China, which is a legal activity, I understand, are now no longer have an income. They no longer have any way of sustaining themselves, and they're now calling for balance. You know, how do we deal with this situation, but at the same time provide them with the rights to a legitimate business? And I'm just wondering how that fits with your thinking. Both, I thought Louise and Giovanni, you might have some ideas on this, because it's all based on, is it based on real data? They were saying, my colleagues in China through the chat were saying it's not based on real data. It's all being based on a knee-jerk reaction. And I'd just like to get your thoughts on that. Louise, is that something you would be able to get at? You're on mute.
Do you mean a knee-jerk reaction in terms of it's not a real problem, or a knee-jerk reaction to coronavirus?
The response, what I was listening to, and I've got my own thoughts on this, but what I was reading through this was that it was a knee-jerk reaction to biased data or improper analysis of data. That's what they were saying. So that's why I thought it might be something for you, Louise, as well as Giovanni, in thinking that, even though it's not trade.
So in terms of biased data, I think that you can't make proper lawful decisions unless you iron out the bias in your data, and therefore questions arise over where you're getting it from, what you're counting, and what you're doing to it. So it's not just the data itself, it's what you then do to it that becomes a problem. But in terms of the specific issue that you're talking about, I don't know what data they've collected or what it's showing.
No, I'm hoping to find out more, but nothing came in further on this. So I was just wondering what your thoughts, if you had, you know, they're just saying that this is a knee-jerk, they said it was a knee-jerk reaction, they being a number of people that are in this group that are discussing it, and they said it was based on incorrect or partial data and was infringing upon the rights of these people to have a living in this manner. So that's all I have. So
if I can probably, Louise, if that's okay for you.
Yes.
I just want to mention that, yes, as a result of that decision in China to essentially ban the consumption of wild meat. And when we say consumption, we really mean the eating of wild meat. It's still possible to use wildlife products for instance, traditional medicine, but you cannot eat any more wild animal meat. Now, in any policy decision, regardless of the quality of the data available, there are gainers and losers. Certainly, among those that lose as a result of this decision, there are those that actually were selling legally wild animal products, and those that were actually making a livelihood out of collecting those wild animals. Now, those that are losing, just like a few years ago, China decided to ban altogether the sale of ivory products. The ivory carvers were among the losers. These are some of the decisions that governments are called to make and try to really balance the benefits for the collectivity and the losses for those who actually lose something from these decisions. In this case, evidently, China was probably more focused on trying to reduce a public health risk rather than protecting the livelihood and the sustainability of the livelihood of a certain part of the population. It's certainly beyond my pay grade to determine whether it was a good or a bad decision, especially with a lack of data available. But certainly, it's quite normal to me that these kind of decisions may have some winners and some losers.
Okay. I've got a couple of questions that came in, and I think we've got about 2 or 3 minutes. One of the questions is, do you think that the coronavirus and the fact that there are less rangers in national parks who are supposed to be able to protect our wildlife from poaching has an even more negative impact in the current situation we are facing? Giovanni, you're shaking your head. I've got another one for you here, Louise, and for Esther.
Yes, that's a very possible scenario where the parks in Africa, for instance, are losing revenues from the lack of tourism, and those revenues were going to be used to enforce anti-poaching patrols. Now, that lack of revenues for parks most likely leaves those parks more exposed to the possibility of poaching. There have been some cases that have been documented, but at this stage it's still anecdotal, and there is a need of collecting information to actually determine for sure whether that has happened during the lockdown that has reduced tourism towards Africa. But it's certainly a very likely risk.
Musonda, were you?
Okay, can I just add something to that point?
Yes.
May I,
yes.
Roger?
Yep. Yes, please go ahead.
I think I mean, one of the things that has emerged in some of the scholars across the African continent, and one whom I've been speaking to, I mean, they're actually counteracting that argument to say that part of the whole issue of conservation and dealing with park management is that we also need, you know, the historical conversation of empowering the communities within the buffer zone to be part of the whole management of these ecosystems. I think the challenge of zoonosis isn't necessarily an animal is killed and then it comes out, or I mean, somehow because of a poacher. The challenge is the actual landscape, the levels of degradation and the proximity. And this is what we are seeing, for instance, with bats. The fact that these supposedly protected, forest ecosystems or non-protected, it could be a communal landscape. If it's degraded, the bats don't have anywhere to go but your house. That's where they're going to pitch. So I think the whole argument is that we have to bear in mind that it has to be a conservation element where it's a collective. And this is what we're beginning to see now more and more. Yeah,
thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And the one I'm going to talk about is, Louise, there is a question: in the age where mass data collection across almost all political parties in most Western democracies is seen as a necessity, a positive, how can we ensure that our privacy is being protected? It was a point you brought up, and you have to take yourself off mute.
Sorry about that. The short answer is we can't. I don't think it's possible, and I think even if it was possible at a national level to ensure that your privacy.
We've lost you. Louise, we've lost you. Are you still there? Louise, we've lost you and you're frozen on my screen anyways.
I'm sorry, I don't know whether I think I dropped again.
Yes, okay. You dropped fairly quickly there. So
yeah, sorry about that. The short answer is no, I don't think we can ensure that our privacy is protected. And I think even at a local level, if we could, it wouldn't work internationally, which is what we've seen with the European litigation around Google and the right to be forgotten. And so I think what we need to do is mitigate the harm that is caused by the infringements of our privacy.
Okay, I think our time is up. Did Chris ever come in?
No, she hasn't, but we've been in communication, and what we've decided we're going to try and do is get her in for the moderated session a bit later. She's been following on the live session. Can I just make the announcement again, because I'm not sure that everyone properly understood. The system that we're using will only allow a limited number of presenters to be on the platform on any given time. So we must only be 10, and then we'll call you in as and when is required. So if you're not presenting, do not come on as a presenter. Just go in as an attendee and we'll call you on.
Okay. I hope everyone takes note of that, and so the next 3 track or sessions will be able to go forward. I understand that our time is up, and I'd like to thank very much our speakers. We're looking forward to hearing more from the participants in the follow-up session to this, which is on the 9th of June at the same time. And this will be a focus on track 1. That is, what are the key factors driving infectious disease emergence in the 21st century? And I look forward to you joining us at that time. Thank you. And thanks to this presenters. Thank you.
Yeah,
so
thank you all. Thank you all. That was really a very stimulating, informative, and well-rounded discussion. And we're going to swiftly move on. I'm going to bring in our moderator, who's back online, who is Isaac. So let me just see. Yeah, he's back on. So Silas, can you take over to get him on?
How do I get off?
Is this working?
Yes.
Oh, great. All right. I will reserve my comments about Microsoft Teams for another day. But so thanks. Very interesting first panel. I'm here to moderate track 2, which is titled, "What are the current models and approaches used to predict and track infectious disease outbreaks in the 21st century?" I am a senior lecturer at Strathmore University in Nairobi. I'm also the director of CIPIT, the Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology Law. And I'm going to be moderating a panel with 2 presenters and 2 responders to those 2 presenters. So I'll just jump right in because we only have 40 minutes. The first presenter is Professor Hamish McCallum. He's professor at Griffith University and leader of the Planetary Health Research Theme in Griffith's Environmental Futures Research Institute. He's been working on the ecology of infectious disease for over 40 years and is currently a principal investigator on a multi-million-dollar project investigating the spillover of viruses from bats to humans across 3 continents. So, Professor Hamish, McCallum, if you would please take about 5 to 7 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have some slides, so if they could be brought up, that would be great. Otherwise, I could try to share my screen, but I think it's probably going to be easier. But whilst they're coming up, what I wanted to do was just to make about half a dozen fairly basic points about the factors that can lead to disease emergence, particularly of zoonotic diseases. So diseases that emerge from other animals, particularly wildlife, into humans. So are the slides coming? I could try sharing my screen, but I think we were asked to try to do them from the other end. Here we go. Excellent. Terrific. They're in a slightly strange format at the moment. Sometimes we get them into screen share mode, I mean, into slideshow mode, it would be better. Lost them into, oh, here we go. Excellent, okay. So next slide, please. Okay, so the very first point I want to make is that disease emergence is increasing. So this is at least a decade out of date, but it's just showing the number of emerging infectious disease events per decade up to about 2000. And the critical point I want to make, apart from the fact that these things are increasing, is that most of the emerging infectious disease events in humans are coming out of wildlife, and well, coming out of zoonotic diseases, and in particular out of wildlife. And there's a bunch of reasons for those. Some of those have been canvassed already. As Musanda was talking about, one of the very critical things that's happening is habitat destruction, bringing people in contact with wildlife carrying pathogens which they hadn't previously been in contact with. Another one is climate change. So next slide. This is, well, next couple of slides are from a paper that I published a couple of years ago with a bunch of colleagues. And it's making the point that there are essentially three routes of zoonotic spillover from wildlife through to humans. There's the route that comes through direct excretion, so the pathogen is shed by the wildlife, directly picked up by the humans, and there's a bunch of stages that need to be run through in order for them to be transferred to the humans. I'll be talking about them in a second. The second one is the route which is via slaughter. So wildlife markets, of course, and the wildlife trade, consumption of wildlife, a number of pathogens can be transmitted directly by either consumption of the infected carcass itself or by the transmission that occurs as a result of the process of the slaughtering and the butchering and so forth. And the final one is via vector-borne diseases, which Esther was talking a little bit about. So next slide. Okay, this one is what I wanted to spend a little bit of time on. The process of spillover is a multi-layered one, and there's a bunch of barriers essentially which have got gaps in them which need to line up in space and time for a spillover to occur. So coming from the top down, there's the reservoir host distribution. You've got to have the host which is carrying the pathogen to be overlapping in space and time with the spillover host, and they've got to be at reasonably high density. That will drive both pathogen prevalence and pathogen intensity. One of the issues, obviously, with wildlife markets is you're dramatically increasing the density of the reservoirs in the market, and that is likely to increase both the prevalence and the intensity of infection. The pathogen then needs, obviously, to be released from the reservoir host. And again, the process that can occur in both habitat destruction and in wildlife markets are likely to stress the host. We've got very good evidence from some of the work we're doing on bats that as you stress bats, they're far more likely to shed virus. The virus has then got to survive and spread in the community. It then needs to be exposed to the recipient host. And in this particular diagram, it's labeled human, but one of the important things which I think we've seen with this current coronavirus is that very frequently, this is a double-stage process. It spreads initially from the reservoir host, which might be a bat, to some sort of a bridge host, which for the coronavirus, it's been argued might be pangolins. In Australia, we have something called enterovirus, where the bridge host is a horse. So that bridge host or the human host needs to be exposed. And then there's a bunch of within-host processes that need to be got through. So the structural barriers such as those in the skin, there's issues to do with the immune response and molecular compatibility before you can get the spillover event occurring. So any of those processes, one may be able to detect an incipient spillover by having some form of big data or machine learning which can detect those relevant changes. So moving on, the next slide. Once spillover's occurred, there's a number of different stages in which it can happen. So this is from a paper published a few years ago by Jamie Lloyd-Smith. So you can have pathogens which are in a reservoir, get into one host and never go any further. So rabies is a very good example of that. It spills over continually, but there's no human-to-human transmission. Then you can get to the next stage when you've got stuttering chains of transmission amongst the spillover hosts. So it spreads in very small little outbreaks, but never really goes anywhere. And then you've got this final stage, which is when you're likely to get a pandemic, when you get sustained outbreaks. So you get sustained human-to-human transmission as we're getting now, and you get a pandemic. So one can potentially have something which can detect the stuttering chains before they get to the level of the sustained epidemic. So there's a bunch of things where appropriate monitoring, appropriate machine learning, appropriate big data might perhaps give us some advance warning. I've got just a couple more minutes and a couple more slides. So if we can have the next slide, please. R0, the basic reproductive number, is all over the media at the moment, but it is an absolutely crucial thing to understand. It's the number of secondary cases per primary case when the pathogen is first introduced into a naive population. So this isn't rocket science. If each primary infection produces more than one secondary infection, the infection will spread. If it doesn't, it'll die out. R0 doesn't include anything like acquired immunity, so once an epidemic's been going for sufficiently long, then the reproductive number will drop. R0 isn't talking about that. So if something happens in a community or an environment which pushes R0 from below 1 to above 1, you'll get a disease emergence. Conversely, if you want to be able to eliminate the pathogen, then you need to be doing something to drive R0 below 1. I've just got one more slide. Okay, so to understand R0, you need to break it into its two component parts. And one is the infection rate per unit time, and the other is the time the infection persists. And I don't think I've got time to go through all of these things, but as Esther was saying, these are complex processes, and each of those two components depends on a variety of things, including the behavior of the hosts and the vectors, and host density and abundance, and so forth. So it's not surprising that in crowded apartment buildings or cruise liners, one gets a rather higher R0 than you get in a rural environment. The second important thing about R0 is it depends critically on the time the infection persists in an infected host. So pathogens which kill hosts very, very quickly, such as Ebola, as a rule do not spread particularly well because they essentially kill the host before they are able to spread further. The final point I want to make, one of the things that's been frustrating me, whoops, go back one slide, it's okay, I can just talk through it. One of the things which is frustrating when you read a lot of the media about R0 is they talk about the R0 of COVID-19, of the coronavirus. R0 depends on the disease triangle which Esther was talking about. It's not just a characteristic of the pathogen, it's a characteristic of the pathogen and the host in the particular environment. And if one is attempting to drive R0 down, one can do it by manipulating any of those three arms or some combination of them. So the very, very last slide is just to make the point of infection occurring via a series of chains of transmissions through generations. And as you get more individuals infected, then you have more of the contacts occurring not with a susceptible host, but with one that is either already infected or has previously been infected and is recovered. And so your effective reproductive number will go down until eventually, of course, you reach this concept of herd immunity. But the catch with herd immunity, which I'm sure everybody's aware of, is if you're taking something like the current coronavirus, the R0 is ballpark about 2, and that means that you only get herd immunity when roughly you've got 1 minus 1 divided by R0 of the population infected, which is about 60%. And if you've got a death rate of 1%, that's a lot of dead people. I think that's about all I need to say at the moment, so thank you. Someone is muted, I think.
Oh, I was muted. Is that better?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. Yeah, I was keeping up with the news in the United States, and they've got great resources of state-by-state R0 values, and you can go and rank the states. So that's very timely. Thank you very much. Is Professor Mbogo on here? I wasn't able to see her in the list, but maybe.
Can you? I know this is out of the lineup. I think she's going to come back in shortly, okay. But you can move to John.
I also see that Erin Mordeka is in. Is she? Because she was also planned to be a speaker. Is she available to speak as well, or no?
With the announcement, she left, but hopefully they're coming back in.
Okay. Well, that's all of the presenters. So we have now we have 2 responders. Although I also, is Paul Cassili in? Dr. Cassili, is he here? No. Okay. I think we're down then to just Dr. Ogutu. think I saw him on the list as having joined. Goodness. So we have no one else in this panel available. Is that Femi? Is that right?
Now I can see John is Professor John is on the line. I can see him here.
Okay.
If he's gone quiet, but he's certainly on the line. Maybe we can just skip him. What I suggest then, can I ask Abdullahi, at this moment, are there questions coming in from the audience?
We don't have any questions as of yet. However, if the audience has any questions, they can send them over to the live event Q&A, and we could share with the panelists.
I have a message from Paul Kasili, Dr. Kasili. He's here, so I'll just introduce him real quick. He is professor at Bunker Hill Community College in Boston. I thought it was in Charleston, Massachusetts, where he teaches biology, genetics, and biotechnology. He has concurrent academic appointments with Boston University, Brandeis, and Northeastern, where he teaches biology and biochemistry. He's also a VP and co-founder of Deep Baobab AI, an AI for analytics startup company in Boston. So, Dr. Kasili. Well, he messaged me that he's here, so. Okay, while we wait for him, if he actually is, we do have a question, and it is for you, Professor McCallum. Good thing. Let me see here. Regarding the spread of COVID-19, which looks not that equal around the world, i.e. more in European Latin countries than European Germanic countries, and more in the US than Africa, for example, what could be the environmental factors which could explain those variations?
Obviously it's a question a lot of people are thinking about. There's a number of drivers. I mean, I think one is simply population density. In Australia, we've been very fortunate. We've had a very small number of cases. And I suspect a lot of that is that we do not live in apartment buildings. And so I think if you're looking particularly, the very dense population in Manhattan, all things being equal, R0 depends on population density because it depends on contact rate. So that's certainly a driver. I think there are some special characteristics of Italy which were important. In Italy, multi-generational families living in the same house it's one of the wonderful features of Italy, and as is the passeggiata and the hanging around in bars. So I think the social structure of a community is very important. Whether or not there are climatic drivers is an interesting question. I think when one sees what's currently happening in Brazil, the fond belief of Donald Trump that once warm weather came, it would all disappear has been proven to be completely false. But yeah, it's one in Australia, we introduced social distancing quite quickly. And once you start shutting down public transport, shutting down schools, closing down bars and so forth, then to believe that you've changed the contact rate by a factor of 2 or 3 is not at all unreasonable, and that's sufficient to suppress the epidemic.
I have a follow-up to that. I can very much understand why transmission rates would vary from location to location. I'm having trouble understanding why the death rate varies so much from a country to a country. It seems, even very well developed countries with very good healthcare systems can have a relatively high death rate. And I just thought maybe you could talk about that, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean that's I don't have any direct experience of that, but a bunch of my colleagues who are rather closer to this are fairly confident that the rate of reporting is the rate of testing is certainly very, very variable between countries. And so there are some countries which will only test when someone is admitted to hospital. There are others who are doing something approaching community testing. And so if the only cases you're reporting are ones which have been verified by the PCR test, then you can easily have tenfold differences in the actual level of prevalence in the community compared with the reported levels. So I think that's a significant driver in a lot of cases. Okay. And frankly, I don't believe the data that are coming out of Russia, for example. If one looks at the number of cases in Russia and one looks at the mortalities, it just doesn't make sense. So yeah. I suspect there's a lot of unreported mortality.
Sure. Okay, over to the organizers. Do we have any of the other four, Drs. Kasili, Ogutu, Mboga, or Mordeka?
At this stage, not, and I'm not, to be honest, sure why. They were in a moment ago and they've left and can't go back in. So what I'm going to suggest at this stage is if we put this back, let's call on the next panel, unless what I would suggest, however, is that I know from the discussions we had prior to this track that there were particular issues that would be raised. I'm wondering whether you can elucidate on some of them whilst we try and get them in.
You're asking me to do that, yeah?
Yes, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. Well, there's one particular that I was going to pose to all of the panelists, one particular question, and that was something that's coming in the next panels, as you informed me. But I thought that it would be good to have a very broad discussion, so as many different backgrounds, people with as many different backgrounds to address this particular question, and that is. The very obvious and very common question that we hear today, which is about the balance of public health and collecting data about people and what they're doing and where they're going, and balancing that with their right to privacy and other issues of data protection. And I know that no one has the answer to that, obviously. Well, everyone has the answer and no one agrees on what that answer will be. But I thought maybe we could have each of our panelists address that. So certainly, Professor McCallum, if you've had any thoughts on that over the last day or so?
Well, I mean, one of the thoughts I have is that in Australia, we have been very strongly encouraged to download this so-called COVID Safe app, which uses Bluetooth technology, supposedly to be able to then allow contacts to be traced. And there's been an enormous amount of concern about where those data are being stored. The counter argument, I guess, is that Google already knows far more about you than this thing will anyway. But the practical concern I have is those sorts of invasions of privacy are worth it if there is a very substantial benefit. And if you've got this thing that it requires both parties, the potential infected party and the potential contact, to both have the thing operating. And that means that if your level of frequency of use of this in the community is, say, 60%, then the chance that you and the person, the contact with whom it's occurring, you've both got it running is 0.6 squared, which is about 40%, or 0.36. And my feeling is that it will be essentially impossible to get that a sufficiently high level of use of the thing in the community for it to be of any value at all. So you're going to have all the downsides of the potential violations of privacy, and I would be very surprised if you're getting any benefits at all which are usable for contact tracing purposes. And I think it's interesting that the Australian government has gone enormously quiet on this technology in the last week or so. They were pushing it like mad 3 or 4 weeks ago. They haven't said a thing about it for the past week.
Well, that is very interesting. I know there's been a lot of challenges, both technical and sort of sociological challenges to whether those apps even work or not. So certainly in the circles that I run in for data protection and privacy. Femi, I see that there are 3 other questions in the chat.
Yes.
Would you want me to pose those to Professor McCallum, or do you want to move on?
No, I think that's a good idea, and I've seen a question come in that looks like it certainly needs addressing. So please do continue.
Okay. So on our one-man panel, Professor McCallum, here you go. Regarding the zoonotic spread of some diseases, is there any proof of the virus mutating as it spreads from pangolins and bats to humans, as alluded to by you?
Well, viruses mutate continuously, and there is some wonderful work that's being done at the moment where you can track the movement of the virus through the United States by simply looking at the mutations that have occurred. So there was an initial wave that came in from China, but most of the infections in New York have their nearest ancestors in infections that came out of Europe. So the notion, I mean, viruses mutating is something that happens continuously. Viruses mutate randomly, and they also, selection operates on them to increase zoonotic. That's what one can expect evolution to do. And that will, in general, tend to make the pathogen less harmful because it will therefore persist longer in the infected individual and spread better. At the community level, that may mean there'll be more total deaths. But in terms of the probability of me being infected with it, dying, one would expect that that probability will decrease through time because less pathogenic strains will be selected for. But yeah, there's also evidence, again, this is on the edge of my expertise, that there have been some genetic changes in the virus that came out of the bats, which have made it obviously more able to infect humans, and that may have involved being passage through pangolins. Yeah. But the pangolin thing is speculation at the moment. Okay. Is my understanding. There's some evidence, but it's not convincing.
Okay. Another question here, although you already sort of addressed this, some specialists were mentioning seasonality in the spread of the disease, but it spreads in all hemispheres. Did you have anything further to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when one's talking about seasonality can have a variety of effects. It can have an influence on how long the virus persists in the environment. But crucially, seasonality is a very strong driver of human behavior. So if one looks, for example, at something like measles, particularly in the pre-vaccination era, it was fundamentally driven by the school year. And so it was getting all the kids together at the beginning of the school year and the high contact which drove the infection. So I think one can expect, well, seasonal flu is a similar example. A lot of it is just that in cold places, when winter comes, everybody is inside and they're spending far more time in close contact with other people than they are in the summer. So it may be driven by human behavior rather than anything to do with the actual thermal biology of the pathogen.
I actually have a question that I've been thinking about over the last few weeks. I saw a video on WhatsApp that showed, I think it was Chinese school children going back to school, and they're going through this very elaborate decontamination process to get into their classroom, all sorts of sanitizer everywhere. And this question may be outside of your expertise, but if you can say anything about it. After we finally emerge from this COVID pandemic, are we all going to die of bacteria that have super bacteria that have kind of survived and been strengthened by all of the antibiotics we've been using? Because that's been a problem even before COVID.
Well, antibiotics and antivirals are very different. I mean, nobody ought to be using antibiotics to try to combat COVID because it's a virus, it's completely useless. And I think the disinfectants are much less subtle, if you like, than antibiotics. So if you're whacking somebody with 80% alcohol, it kills lots of things, but it's pretty hard for an organism to evolve resistance to 80 or 90% alcohol.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. I'm just gonna keep going. Femi, let me know if I should stop. Here's one more. What is your impression of the level of cooperation between scientists globally? To what extent has the deglobalization in politics impacted? And now I just lost my question. Well, hang on. Just a sec. To what extent has where'd it go? There we go. To what extent has the deglobalization in politics impacted cooperation between scientists and scientific institutes?
Again, this is right on the fringes of my expertise, but I mean, I've certainly been encouraged by the amount of cooperation that is happening. So one of the vaccines that's being developed in Oxford is being tested by one of my colleagues on this large grant we've got at his high containment lab in Montana. There's also some work being done on it in the Australian Animal Health Laboratory, which is another high containment lab. So I think there's been a lot of, I mean, clearly there's a lot of competition about who's going to try to get a vaccine first. But I think there's been pretty extraordinary levels of cooperation. And I think in China, there was clearly the resistance by the local authorities to release information about the disease when it first emerged. I think they just didn't want to give bad news to Beijing, but they released a full sequence of the virus very, very quickly. And that was picked up by other people extremely rapidly. So I think there's been a lot of transparency, frankly.
Oh, that's very good to hear. I don't know if you can answer this, but I'll pose it anyway. What is being missed when all studies rely on Western systems of knowledge? Is there any value that has come from other systems of knowledge? And I assume by that probably more focused on African research and development. Do you know anything about that?
Unfortunately, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, clearly there are different systems of knowledge, and I think there's a certain. I can't talk about Africa remotely, but I do know in Australia that Aboriginal Indigenous knowledge about the environment is in many ways more sophisticated than much of what we know, particularly with regard to things like fire. But in terms of dealing with pathogens in Africa, I really couldn't talk.
Okay. Femi, how would you like to proceed?
No, I think, guys, you've done amazingly well. So, look, hat off for sure. This is quite challenging. It's actually, in some ways, it brings home the idea that technology solves all. We're kind of in that. We're in that kind of moment as we speak. But what you've been able to do is definitely keep the discussion going in a very commendable way, and I'm very grateful to both of you. And we shall be, kind of reviewing how we or what platforms we use and so on and so forth. These are all kind of testing times. We're all trying new technologies to see what works in the current space we're in. So good feedback that we can send to those who own the platforms and so on. So
Femi.
Yes.
If I may, there's a question that just came in, and I would like to address it actually.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Please do.
It says, to me, wouldn't or shouldn't a corporation like Google be able to cooperate with governments in order to provide data and analytics on how people move and interact in order to help with contact tracing? So I have been researching this a bit. Google has an office in Kenya, and even in countries where they don't have offices, they are constantly getting requests from governments all over the world to release all kinds of data that they hold, whether that is search data or GPS data or anything that maybe the Android operating system is collecting. So sometimes, well, they have a very elaborate procedure for releasing that data. And oftentimes it will depend on the purpose. If it's a criminal investigation, that may be different from something like this, because they would need, they would have to think about releasing specific individual user data, whereas for this you would be requesting anonymized data. So that is definitely possible. Governments can work and do work with the tech companies to do that. However, there are some papers out, and the authors are escaping my mind at the minute, but that really show the challenges of contact tracing in the context of, for specifically in Africa. We use our devices in very different ways, and we have some unique, some nuances about our, for example, our GPS data, our usage data for cell phones. That's it's very unique to certain societies and cultures. It varies a lot, and so it can have gender aspects. It can have generational aspects, so the age of the individuals, all of that stuff impacts the user data, and so it's actually extremely difficult to factor all of those different problems, those different factors into your data, and then pull out any reliable information at all. So I know people have tried, and I think in general they have all failed, and until we figure out how to account for all those different factors, I think that will continue to be very difficult. So Femi, back to you.
Thank you for that. Those kind of last points on this particular panel. Now we're going to move on to panel 3. Our moderator, like others, is struggling to get on the call, so yours truly will have to step in. And this is an exciting panel, and in lots of ways, the fact that it's the most numerous may account for the kind of scientific edge that's included in this panel. So our panel, in lots of ways, is discussing big data. What does it mean in this context? What are the applications of AI, machine learning, and big data in predicting infectious disease outbreaks and patterns of transmission and spread? And we are, honored by everyone who's a panelist today, and sometimes recall some particular call out. And we have Professor Bella Stantic, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, from University of Australia, Griffith University of Australia. In our discussions, and it was very interesting, it has been, one of the leading predictors of all kinds of situations due to his science. And I'm very excited for all of you to hear and understand where he's coming from and what he knows. So without further ado, can I introduce Professor Bella Stantic?
Thank you. As you said, I'm from Griffith University from Australia. At the moment, it's 40 minutes after midnight, and so I say good morning, good day, and good evening to all participants. So I'm director of Big Data and Smart Analytics Lab. I'm founder as well. I have some presentation. Would it be possible to put it on, please? So during this short 5 minutes, what I was told to say something, I will try to demonstrate what is possible to do with big data analytics. Professor Hamish just talked about how big data and AI can help, and even in this pandemic situation, I have a project when I'm helping Australian Queensland government to do the prediction and other things as well. So, but to demonstrate what is possible, I will show in these few slides. So can I have another slide, please? When I was starting my career, one of my senior colleagues said, it's easiest just to put one picture, because one picture says 1,000 words. So in this another slide, which is, I think, coming, it's attention, what my predictions, my correct, bold predictions about basically everything what I have done based on big data analytics and methods and algorithms, what we and I developed here at Griffith University. So that resulted that I was the Nostradamus of 21st century. Obviously, I don't have a crystal ball. All what I have, it's a huge amount, mostly publicly available data, and also algorithms, and I also have a high power computing. So can I have a next slide, please? And this is all my predictions and attract huge attention in the media. So these are some of the clusters that we have here at Griffith University. In addition to this, I have clusters, GPU clusters, which we are using for deep learning. So could I have another slide, please? So that I don't want to advertise, but I had to put this one because to gain the insight of what is actually big data analytics, it's easiest to take this free massive open online course what I and my researchers developed here at Griffith Universities. And it's in latest offer, it attracted more than 10,000 enrollments from all around the world. And the feedback from students who and people who enrolled, it's really positive. How valuable is this course as a starting point to understand what is actually big data analytics? A lot of people don't have feeling what it is and what everything consists and what everything you must know and what environment to have and so on. So that can I have next slide, please? So in a nutshell, obviously in this short, I cannot say a lot of go into details, but to do the big data analytics, it's a combination of a lot of techniques and what is important as well, to harnessing the diverse high volume of data, which are coming with a very, most often coming very high velocity. Usually it's mentioned 4 V's, volume, variety, and velocity. And it relies on a lot of techniques. A lot of them we haven't even published yet because they are groundbreaking. They're working too good, so we haven't decided what we're going to do with that one. So it's obviously it's a lot of machine learning, supervised, unsupervised, deep learning wherever we are working with images and videos. And toward the end of my presentation, I will show you a variety of projects which rely on all sorts of methods. Obviously, a lot of data mining, statistical modeling, and as you could see that I do the social media analysis and sentiment, topic modeling, targets, and obviously a lot of natural language processing as well. So what we rely basically is these methods learn over the time and treat that as a notation. So basically, indirectly, you have a supervised learning. If you have more data and more time, accuracy is more accurate. That is the result that I get now all elections correct. In US election, I got 49 out of 50 states, when everyone is saying Hillary will win. And in the latest federal election, I got all 77 seats correct when they were giving even $7 if coalition wins. And I predicted that every seat that they will win and have a majority government, Brexit and everything. But I'm not using these elections only as a test bed to test methods and algorithms for funded projects, and I will give you later list. So that, for example, obviously all of us, depending on age, gender, education level, we have a specific vocabulary. You can train the system and have a predictive model, and we are doing that obviously. And you say one sentence, I know with 90% accuracy your age, gender, education level, and so on. And in a similar way, you can do basically anything if you have sufficient data and obviously, and if you have a computing power. Can I have a next slide, please? So these are some of the list of the funded projects in my big data analytics lab. It's too many details, but just wanted to show you diversity. As I said, there is a harnessing social media and data analytics on how people have been influenced and react to pandemic situation and introduce measures. This is project currently funded by Australian Queensland State. Monitoring community wellness with social media, similar. I'm involved with Professor Brendan Mackay, who is leading Griffith University Climate Change Beacon project. He talked earlier today or tonight, depending where you are. Also, that one project where you use the GPUs as a computing power, it's measuring aesthetic and experience value and so on. There's a lot of others as well in tourism, in traffic management and so on. So it's basically to demonstrate what everything you can do if you have a sufficient data, and it's impressive how high accuracy you can achieve by analyzing data. So can I have next slide, please? So in all my talks, I always acknowledge the army of people who are behind me in my big data and smart analytics lab, all my researchers, my colleagues, my PhD student, and also professor that I collaborate. And so I just wanted to put the slide and thank them, because that's the work of all of us. So next slide, and that's approximately everything. I think it fits in about my 5 minutes. I'm happy to answer questions later, more specific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stante. I think that's, I know when we first had a conversation, I was, I wouldn't say dumbfounded, but certainly I was very interested in this idea that data solves everything. So I want us to pick up on this some more during the course of this particular panel. And I want to invite at this stage Dr. Barbara Han. And we're going to move, if you like, from this kind of large picture and focus in on some specifics, which Barbara from the Carey Institute, focusing much more on the kind of zoonotic kind of issues and so on. And she has some very interesting points to put across to us. So Barbara, if we, Silas, please, can you get Barbara on so we can move to the next speaker.
Can everybody see and hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I don't have slides. I think what I'll do is just give a very brief 5-minute overview of the kinds of data that I work with and the types of prediction problems that my group is most interested in solving with respect to zoonotic disease emergence. I'm an ecologist by training, and I use machine learning algorithms to make predictions about the kinds of animals that we might expect to give rise to the next zoonotic pathogen, pathogens which may be undiscovered as of yet and unknown to humans. We also make predictions about the kinds of viruses or pathogens or other pathogens that, what distinguishes those pathogens that are able to cross that species barrier, specifically from animal hosts into humans or from insects into humans. And we do this by using several different machine learning approaches, which rely fundamentally on the available data that describe these organisms. So, for example, in the work that we do with primarily mammals, our interest lies in trying to understand what is it that distinguishes that small fraction of species that does such a good job at carrying pathogens that can transmit to humans. Our initial work just started with a very large animal group that sort of has a bad reputation, rodents specifically. We wanted to know why there are some rodents that carry up to 12 or 13 different zoonotic diseases within that same organism, whereas others seem to carry nothing that is of import to humans. When we did that analysis all the way back in 2015, we made some bold predictions about which species had the highest risk, and some of those predictions at the very top of our list have been borne out by independent field validation. So scientists going out, collecting data on species in the field and discovering that there are indeed pathogens that are found in these particular species. Now, fast forward a couple of years, and we're working in environments where Ebola is now emerging. And on the heels of Ebola virus in West Africa, we have the Zika virus emerging in South America and globally. And in those contexts, we've been able to draw from the data that we do have available for particular animal groups. So in the case of Zika virus, we looked at primate data. And in the case of Ebola virus, we looked at bat species data. And the goal in both of those analyses was really to try to focus our surveillance attention on the most high-risk groups. This is particularly important in places like West Africa and in South America, where the biodiversity is incredibly high, and we have limited resources for being able to surveil those species. Where do we focus our surveillance dollars so that we get the biggest bang for our buck? What should we be looking at to be looking for these viruses? In those situations, we've been able to make some predictions that were independently also field validated. So for example, with the Ebola virus outbreak, the question was, it seems to come from bats. That's what all the evidence suggests. How do we focus our surveillance effort to find the bats that do carry these novel filoviruses? Where do they exist? Where are their ranges overlapping with humans? How can we minimize that risk? So we produced these predictions. About 6 months after our paper was published, a group that was working in the Yunnan province of China did validate that the species that was predicted at one of the top 5 species on our list was confirmed as carrying a novel filovirus, so a new sequence, and it expressed the filovirus infection in the lungs, which was a novel tropism in this species that had never been tested filovirus positive before. And these predictions are based on trait data. So these are data that are knowable. They are data that come from decades of field research. So people going out and trying to just understand the environments that we live in from a sort of a basic science perspective, a basic research enterprise output. And as Dr. Santic just mentioned, with increasingly available data, the questions that we are able to tackle, that universe opens up significantly. With respect to being able to make predictions about disease risk and where that risk arises from for humans, the data that are limiting us from making those predictions more accurately are basic data about the species that are in our environments. They are data that describe our ecosystems, they're data that describe our environments and how they function and their integrity, and measuring how that integrity degrades over time and with our development. The species predictions that we make are not limited to vertebrates. They can extend to insects, which we've shown some success for. They can extend to microbes. They can extend to many different elements of their interactions. I think the potential for the application of machine learning using data that describe the basic tenets of how life exists and coexists on Earth is incredibly powerful. And I think that the sort of privacy issues that stem from our collection of data on human populations don't always extend to our collection of data to try to understand biological systems, although our action in response to those predictions is surely a social question with those issues that sort of bind that into a system that we have to decide what to do with that information. I'm happy to take questions. I didn't present any slides, but there were certainly a lot of very pretty pictures I could have shown, but in the interest of time, I just wanted to keep it brief.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you for that. And I suppose what you've done is very clearly demonstrate the application from the kind of macro to the quite narrow in lots of ways. And I think there will be questions. I've already seen a couple of come in to really wanting to unpack and understand, well, how far does this actually go? I think you kind of said it in a nutshell, but I think we need to unpack that some more. And at this stage, what I'll do is invite Dr. John Okoro to come in to discuss what's happening in Kenya, what's happening in the region, maybe even from a kind of Africa's perspective in terms of, big data. What does that mean for the continent? Are we on the periphery or are we center?
Yes, Femi, thank you very much. Can you hear me? I hope.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Thanks, Professor Bella. Thanks, Barbara. I think this is just wonderful panel. Really excited to be with you, all of you. As you mentioned, yeah, I only really want to really present everything about the continent, but I think I'll just make a comment that the COVID-19 just showed the potential that Africa has as a continent. Big data analytics and the whole idea of AI, the whole idea of IoT has just shown how much can really be tapped into. I think we've seen innovations coming up because you realize with big data, a number of things come up. So this is how is data mined, how is data collected. That's what will influence how much data we have. So maybe let me just introduce myself. So I'm John Olukuru from Strathmore University, Kenya. I head data science analytics team at iLab Africa, a research center at Strathmore. Then also we have a new center, the Strathmore Africa Data Analytics Center. So we have a number of projects that are going on, which I think also with this COVID-19, we managed to showcase them. We have a colleague who came up with a contact tracing app because the challenge to realize always is when someone is tested positive, you start looking out and finding out who else was in touch with this person. So the mobile phone becomes the easiest device to start tracking who was closer to this person. So that's something that came up, which has realized it's collecting data. And if that data is mined, now all those tools that Professor Bell has mentioned becomes really very valuable. And then we have a colleague who came up with a health inet solution, which enables to have teleconsultation. It's something that was tried before, but before the COVID-19, people did not realize its value. So in remote areas of Africa, such solutions become very valuable because we don't have infrastructure to have medical centers, hospitals, clinics all over. The GPOs are very few. So realize teleconsultation becomes a vital tool. So now with COVID-19, that has become something. I was participating at the MIT Africa COVID-19 Challenge Hackathon, and I remember listening to the Minister for Education in Sierra Leone and mention about what they're trying to do. Amazing stuff in Africa. They launched a drone corridor, which will deliver malaria medicine to certain town in Sierra Leone, and realized all that is what now is putting Africa on the map. So we are not really at the periphery per se, but there's lots of innovation that have come up, which are also driving the collection of data. Because as Prof mentioned, Professor Bella mentioned, the volume of data has just shown that it's readily available. But now the challenge is, are we able to get that information from that data? Are we able to learn from that information we are collecting now? And readily after that now, what kind of decisions can we be able to make from data? So I could say, Africa, we have that level of now tapping into all these huge data sets. And I think with such kind of courses professors put up there, now we can develop the skill set. So let's have the tools, let's have the resources, let's have the skill set, then we can tap into all these innovations that are really mining huge data sets in Africa. So there's a lot happening, and I'm happy to comment on a few things as we go on with the panel. Thank you, Femi.
Thank you, John, and I love the kind of positive feel about our inclusion as a continent, as a country, as a region, to these exciting developments. Exciting, but at the same time daunting, because we are in lots of ways territory that there are lots of unknowns, and we're still grappling with where does this all take us. But we'll deal with some of those. Hopefully, I've seen some questions that have come in that could be interesting. Let me swiftly move on to our next speaker, who's from the Californian Lutheran University, and that's Associate Professor Njunge. I see you on the line. We're very grateful that this panel has been almost complete. So please, Prof, if you can come on and tell us what you wish to say. You are on mute. Can you unmute yourself?
Thank you for that. I was saying thank you for having me. I'm speaking to you from Ventura in California, which is a county that's open in a state that's still under lockdown to a great extent, in a country with the highest number of cases. And I think that in some ways, for me, sheds some light when we're talking about data and the implications of having data and how they drive decisions. And so we're talking about one pandemic, which is having impacts in very different ways in very different places. And as Professor Bella mentioned earlier, he was talking about the 4 V's of big data. One of the ones he didn't mention necessarily was veracity. And I think this is the big question people are asking is, you show a data set or you show a chart and people are asking, is this really what it says it's representing? And I think this is a significant impact, a significant point to think about. One of the 2 things I just wanted to share and talk about, I'm a professor of organizational leadership. My background is in information systems. And I went to grad school at Claremont, which is right next to Esri, which creates many of the maps that we see. And looking at one of the maps and thinking about the journey that goes to the creation of these maps, as we think of how data gets operationalized and the challenges that we face in such a setting. And it's true that big data and machine learning and AI work very well in certain settings with very specific problems, with well-known variables that have been identified and could potentially be used for projection. But we're in a situation now where some of those variables are not the same. So for instance, I was going to say there's one of the maps is using CHIME, which was developed by University of Pennsylvania, which uses a model that SRI that uses census data in hospitals and checks who's susceptible. And so there's this mathematical model that's been peer reviewed in some journal that's used in the hospital in University of Pennsylvania. And in collaboration with Esri, they can create a map which informs all sorts of organizations across the globe. And so when we think of how impactful and useful information systems can be, it's great to see how well this is working in organizations that collaborate, in well understood academic settings and that kind of thing. So now when we think of how does then this apply in other areas which may not be as well resourced and which may have high, so if we're thinking, say, for instance, in Kenya. And I like the point that the previous speaker, Dr. Olukuru, mentioned about Sierra Leone and other success cases, and it brings to mind for me something like M-Pesa, which is something in some ways I think we could look at of how innovations are made real in settings that are different or that have their own unique settings. And we see M-Pesa has worked in Kenya, but not so much, say, in Uganda or in Tanzania or in other places. And why is that? And so as I come towards that, and when we think of the creation of information systems, there's people who are behind it, who are involved. There's structures, organizational structures, and the data which I talked about. And so having the right people to talk about and get on the same page, I think is significant. I think one of the previous speakers talked about how bats are flying across the US. And I'm not as familiar about what organizations or agencies are able to share data across all those areas and what actions are able to be carried out. And as I come towards the end here, even when we're thinking of developing information systems, the sense of urgency is so high that the methods of developing the systems often require agility and require skills and high level of competence of the developers, that you can work in different language, different data sets in order to be able to just collaborate. And so as I'm coming to an end here, I think the last illustration I was giving is around facial recognition, which is one of the emerging uses of AI that had come up. And as we are aware, some biases have been identified in the use of facial recognition. And the way this propagates might also be interesting for us to consider. And the starting point, for instance, in systems like that is a data set. And so when we're thinking, what are the available data sets that these systems are being built on? And are these data sets diverse enough? Are they big enough? And if they're not, what steps are being taken to create broader data sets? And then beyond that, open source technologies are great because they allow us to collaborate quickly, but how are we able to then vet that, algorithms that we're using or taking from someone else don't have any biases inbuilt within them? that can be a significant challenge for the developer themselves. And so as I come to a close, I will say, absolutely, big data offers significant opportunities to the setting, to the pandemic we're facing. But the situation we're in calls for a systematic approach that's broad and inclusive, so that the differences and that exist and people say who are marginalized are not exacerbated, but rather those are taken into account. And some of those decisions need to happen beforehand, upstream, while the development is taking, and after the development has happened over these systems that we talk about, in order to assess whether they're achieving the goals we set out for them to achieve, or what adjustments need to make, and that such adjustments are made in a timely way and include the people whose voices need to be included. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Really, really important subjects, and I think it kind of feeds into what we'll be discussing to a certain degree in the subsequent panel. But I want to kind of open the discussion up a bit here, and one of our audiences has said, and I think you've all touched on this, but kind of it obviously means that we need to unpack this a bit more. And what can big data not predict? I mean, how far? What's the extent of its abilities? And then I'll have a second question that I want to feed into that. So I mean, this. In fact, I'm gonna put that to, if I may, to Professor Bella, to kind of deal with that. Given the kind of mega statement you made at the beginning, I want you to unpack it for our audience. Why are you saying what you're saying? Why is it that data, even with its impurities, and I'll deal with that in a moment, can solve anything?
Yeah, thank you. So if I may say that I don't see the limit. Basically, limits are if I have available data, it is possible to predict everything. And if if you have a domain expert who can identify what are the variables of interest, I'm not worried that much to inconsistent data or even data which are not correct, because they are standing out. We have projects for rumor debunking and fake news and everything, and we can identify. So these things can be found if you have a sufficient data, what are inconsistencies. And even ordinary people in these pandemics are identifying data which might not be accurate, does not follow the trend from all around the world. So short answer is, yes, everything is possible if you have a sufficient data, you know how, you have resources, and you have domain experts who knows how to define the problem. And what is also important, what I usually do, and I was quoted in my statement, I said once, I don't ask data, I let data tells me what is interesting about. And that is the way how you can find very interesting patterns in all areas. And in addition to all my projects, and I even had a very accurate prediction in horse racing. That is interesting. So there's no limit from my point of view.
Barbara?
Femi,
yes, who wants to come in?
Okay, Barbara, you can go ahead. Sorry.
Sure. I would say that I agree for the most part. I think that the caveat to his statement is incredibly important, that if we have enough data, the prediction powers are seemingly limitless. But the hard limit to anything predictive is always data. There are ways that we can deal with data quality. There are ways that we can even deal with bias. There are ways that we can deal with data sparsity. So not having enough of the right kind of data, we can deal with those issues. But if you just don't have data that are representative of the kind of question you're trying to answer, then there's nothing that you can do with machine learning. Machine learning requires data.
And if I may add, requires huge amount of data to have a high accuracy.
John, you were racing to get in there. Do you want to add some points?
Yes. I just wanted to comment briefly. I think there's someone who mentioned about data being like the crude oil. So you can imagine it is the raw material out there. So if you have the input, then definitely you'll always be able to process it and get something out of it. So the reality here is, for sure, there is data out there. And the idea is it possible to mine as much as you can, get that huge data set, and then now through the whole entire processing, you'll be able to predict whatever you really want to. And thus you'll find all possible sectors today are all relying on data. So it's there. We are all data agents. So the phones we have, whatever we do, all these forums you're going through, we are just generating data. So the best way is just, how do we mine it? After it's all mined credibly, then for sure, the process now will take through and we'll be able to predict whatever needs to be predicted. So I really like what Professor Bella says. Give me the data and we'll see what the data tells us.
It's a really interesting analogy, actually, to use oil, because we know, and this is perhaps a note of caution. We've drilled and we've drilled and we've drilled, and we're coming potentially upon problems. Is there a note of caution at all in your enthusiasm for the driver here of data? What's the caution, if any?
If I may, you go ahead.
Go ahead, Professor Bell. I could go ahead.
I just wanted briefly to say that caution is basically privacy of data. Everything else, it's if data are public and that is resolved, and you can identify what all sorts of data could play the important role, then it's okay. You go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the couple of things. One, for sure, privacy is one of them. I think also the goals we're trying to achieve. I think one of the earlier speakers talked about the Sustainable Development Goals. And so given context like that, and Professor Bella had previously mentioned, you need to have a subject matter expert. And so when you start saying, hey, we want to solve, say, poverty, who is the subject matter expert on poverty? And so people who maybe historically are marginalized should actually be front and center in sharing or curating this data, but it's probably a non-trivial task to start to elicit some of this data or create mechanisms for them to share this data in a way that honors their privacy, that gets their consent, that gets their buy-in, in order to get richer and richer and richer data. And so I think those are some of the things. I mean, just here in the US, we're talking about the fact that, say, the CDC and the folks who are making decisions are in disagreement. So when you think about, okay, what's the actual end, we have to understand, say, some of the nuance in between and think about how do we work backwards in order to, so the data quality is not necessarily that you have this wrong variable or that kind of thing. In some ways, I think it's a mismatch between the ends you're trying to achieve and the way you go about getting this data.
And Femi, just to comment, going back to my analogy about the crude oil, to realize the crude oil will not be useful at all until it's refined. So the refinery is the analytics. So the privacy is one aspect, but also the ethics in the whole entire process. So I will predict whatever I want to predict because I want to meet my interest if that could be the different scenario. So privacy and ethics becomes very critical in the whole entire process of using data to make better decisions.
Thank you all for this kind of really good exchange. I'm seeing, let me see, somebody said there's some more questions. I'm going to have to look at the time. We're going to need to be guided on the time, please.
While we're looking at the questions, may I make one additional comment? I think that what Professor Stanton said is really true, that we have, the machine learning algorithms require a lot of data to make use of, but I think in terms of being able to move upstream of things like pandemic scenarios, right? So for COVID, could we have foreseen that COVID was going to be a problem? Could we have made predictions about coronavirus carriers further upstream so that we can do the prevention before it spills over? Those kinds of data are, in my opinion, almost the most sparse. The human data that we would need to clean up the mess or put out that fire might be available for mining if we are able to collect it, but the data that are just missing are the data that we are required to make those predictions that are very far upstream to prevent the spillover from occurring in the first place.
Thank you for that last point. So, sorry, I just want to. There's a question as someone is trying to get in quite urgent. Thanks. And does any of the presenters have experience with the epidemiological models we saw that they were being used to predict the spread of COVID with or without social distancing? We saw quite a bit of variance in the results from these models once the disease started spreading in February.
Yeah, I did some modeling here for Queensland, and basically based on acceptance of the social distancing, based on the weather, density, demography, and everything, and pattern from previous cases from all around the world. I did modeling and I predicted that Queensland should be on 0 in week after Easter, and that was the time when I did the prediction was when cases were on the rise in Australia and Queensland, and I missed by 2 days only in 4 weeks predictions. So it's possible to take it's important to take all sources of data, all possible relevant sources of data, and then prediction can be wrong if you miss some of the relevant source or situation change because of unknown reasons.
Super. So look, I think we could go on like most of the panels for a lot longer, and just to reiterate the point to our audience that these discussions and subjects will be subject to a deeper dive session in a few weeks' time. So can I just extend our gratitude for a really dynamic session and discussion. There's much more to obviously to kind of delve into, pardon the pun. And we look forward to taking forward this particular track. It's a solid one, and we really need to understand the science of it, which a lot of people, me included, we sometimes struggle with. What is the extent and how does the science work? And let's understand that more deeply. So thank you all very much, and please do remain with us as attendees. But we'll ask you to leave the session so we create enough bandwidth to get everybody else on. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Femi.
Thank you. Right, before we start, I'm just going to desperately try and get Professor Louis Franceschi on. We're not sure why he's not able to get on. So just give us just one moment whilst we try and call him in. I think we've stumbled, and at this stage I will turn on my camera because I'm supposed to be seen in this particular panel.
Just 1 second. Femi?
Yes, hi.
Hi, Luis says he's he's online.
Yes, and that's this is live, but this is what these sessions do sometimes. I'm seeing him here as accepted, but we're calling him, and
he can hear us, but apparently we can't hear him.
Yeah, so what's happened is he's accessed the session as an attendee and not as a presenter. And Susan, I know you've been able to navigate this. If you can kindly just explain what you did, because you were attendee previously and then now you're a presenter, if you don't mind.
Yes.
I mean, we have explained, but if we can quickly do that, that would be very, very helpful.
Sure, he has to actually hang up, go back into the original invitation you sent for presenters and accept it and come in that way.
Yeah.
And everybody who's not in the panel has to hang up.
Yes, indeed. So Prof, I'm hoping you've heard that. So you need to hang up and then come back in on the invite that was sent out to the presenters.
There we go.
Oh,
that's good.
Oh, fantastic. Ottilia is here now.
Now my sound is gone.
No, that was my fault. I've been not unmuted myself. So what I suggest is that we start the session. I see that Dr. Isaac is still on session. If you don't mind, Isaac, if you can leave the presenter forum, and I think that will free up space for Professor Louis to come on. Let's see if that works. But in the interest of time, I think we need to press on, and I'll begin proceedings. So this panel, as a kind of wrap up, is really looking at, okay, we've got all this technology, world changing, paradigm changing technology, and what does it mean at that kind of very large point? What does it mean for the ethics of who we are as you know, as humans? What are the governance structures that are important to be laid out with the technology that's developing? The human rights, people's rights to be considered in grappling with, you know, these breakneck speed developments in AI and big data. So without further ado, we're going to hand the reins to Professor Charles Sanford of Griffith University, who's going to speak to us on the work and ideas coming from his experience.
Thank you very much, Femi. I didn't do any PowerPoint, but I did do some dot points, which I sent to you. Can you throw them up on the screen? It doesn't matter too much if you can't. Let's see now, or I can throw that up on the screen myself if I got the correct.
Yeah, I think if you share it from your end, I don't think it went in as a presentation.
No, it wasn't a presentation. It was now. So which button do I put to show my screen?
There should be a share button, and just click on that.
Share button, which is
it's
that?
A little box with an
arrow
next to the microphone. Yeah.
Oh, that one. Okay. Right. Okay. Right. Fine. This is the short version of what I'm talking about briefly. Data about where we are, whom we are close to, about our symptoms, diagnoses, prognoses, and responses to treatment. That data belongs to us and should hopefully be protected by our privacy right. If an academic researcher wants to collect such information, it must be voluntarily given with full knowledge, must be de-identified, and consent can be withdrawn at any time and for any reason. And if we academics offer a reward, this must not be so that the subject of the research is encouraged to consent against their interests. You can understand just how strict the conditions under which academics can access this information. I won't say anything about so-called social media companies, which don't have those stringent requirements. But of course, what we're talking about here is where governments can sometimes require the collection of such information, classically with sexually transmitted diseases, now with COVID. This information is intended to be collected for a very, very, very important purpose. That purpose does not override human rights, but is compatible with them. It advances the right to life, the right to health, as well as human security and SDGs. And Susan Harris-Rimmer will say much more about that. The point I want to make is that collection of this kind of data is justified by advancing those human rights of life to those who are and those who might become infected. But it is only justified to the extent that it does advance those rights, and that the use of these surveillance powers are used only to the extent necessary to fulfil those human rights. Of course, the governance issue is that that although this data may be collected for very important human rights reasons, abuse of these powers to collect and use this information threatens a broad spectrum of human rights. So something that's created in order to further human rights might be wrongly used, abused for other purposes. So the key ethical issue is that this information and these structures should only be used for the purposes of securing the lives of those whose information this is, and other people whose lives are threatened by COVID or other diseases, and that this information ethically should not be used for any other purposes. To use that information for other purposes is a serious abuse of power, and according to Transparency International's definition, is corrupt. Also, the thing is that the misuse of this information undermines the trust in institutions involved and understands the vital reciprocity that's involved in the sharing of this information, as it does in so many other COVID issues. We need to be clear about this ethical justification and provide ethical guidance for how such power should be used and how it should not be used. But we will naturally not be content to merely clarify ethical responsibilities. The good people follow ethical advice, the others do not. There will be a temptation to use the information collected for other purposes or to collect other information that's not necessary for the health reasons for collecting. The very existence of large amounts of information will attract those who would seek to gain access to it and to use it for their own purposes. The issue then becomes a governance one. What governance mechanisms need to be in place to maximise the chances that when data like this is collected, it is used only for the purposes for which its collection is justified and not for other purposes. And this is what involves a number of, it involves what I see as the governance trinity: legal regulation, aligned economic incentives and institutional design. Let me briefly explain what I mean by that. Firstly, of course, when it comes to legal regulation, the question we should ask is what laws and enforcement mechanism should be in place to make it, to penalise and to prevent as far as possible the abuse of this, the power to collect such data. It includes things like whistleblower protection, rewarding whistleblowers, and serious penalties for breaches, including exclusion from the industry and exclusion from office. Secondly, the question is what economic incentives can we align with ethical behaviour, and what disincentives can we align with unethical behaviour? I'll not go to great length on these or any other measures. However, we would always suggest that new work and new contracts should always go to the most ethicals, those that we can trust with our information. Individuals accessing and misusing information could be locked out of the industry, and corporations misbehaving might be split up or closed down, what John Braithwaite calls corporate capital punishment. On the whole, though, as Bentham pointed out, it is the probability, not the severity of sanctions that counts. This leads us to the last element of institutional design. We should always ask, for any matter, but in this particular case with the collection of data for COVID and other health issues, what institutional arrangements make it easy to do the ethical thing, hard to do the unethical thing, and make discovery of those who do so likely that no rational official would act unethically. And in that case, the only people you have to worry about are the irrational, and which, apart from US presidential elections, is not generally a problem. In this case, we'd expect protocols for accessing and using information that make it difficult to get in and leaves very clear evidence of who's been there. This is a form of tracing of those who are accessing the information. We should also note that governance mechanisms are not confined to the state levels, but what we really need is a coordinated multi-level governance reform. As in so many other areas, we find that weaknesses of governance at one level exacerbate weaknesses at other levels. What we need to do is look to international norms, often generated within the UN system. We need to regional norms and mechanisms, as in the EU and increasingly in the AU. We need national and subnational laws, corporate social responsibility, professional responsibility of the medical, legal and IT professionals involved. Rights can be backed by the ownership of data, with ownership rights just not signed away with inadequate information. We need to have tracing of all those who access the data. We need independent bodies to oversee schemes, share best practice and encourage better practice. And we also need WHO internationally and various bodies nationally, the best institutions to take part in such regimes will vary from country to country. And I'd like to say that there is a lot of pressure for some of these tracing apps, although as some of the Australians have previously commented, that people, I think Hamish McCallum made the point that Australia has talked a lot about having tracing apps. They've gone quiet on it. But if there are tracing apps and other sort of sources of data that we find that are likely to protect our privacy, our human rights, I'd like to think that if we could design good mechanisms to identify the correct use and prevent the abuse of such powers, it might be also useful in some of the other surveillance that is done on us and to us on other issues outside of the health area. So that's all I'd like to say by way of introduction.
Thank you very much, Charles, for a very kind of thorough overview of some of the key issues involved here. We'll obviously get to a session where we kind of discuss some of these points in finer detail. Can I swiftly move on? And I'm very pleased to see Ottilia here, from a Microsoft attorney, emerging markets of AI and ethics. Ottilia, we've had some issues regarding the system, and it's good that you're here because you'll see how it's all working, and we can feedback as well. But what's important from your point of view, or from our point of view of having a big tech representative on it, where is Microsoft on these issues?
Thank you, Femi, and my apologies. Sometimes technology fails us or is too complex to use, so we'll take the feedback for sure. I'm not the techie. I'm not an engineer, so can't really take any action at the moment. With regards to Microsoft, and this touches very well to the introduction that was just provided by Professor Sanford, but so from a Microsoft perspective, the way that we've seen this, in the absence of regulation, we've adopted a set of standards, or rather in the absence of regulation in all the countries that we operate. We've adopted a set of AI principles that we are leveraging in guiding the decisions we make around the development of AI technologies and also the distribution of AI technologies. So who we would partner with or who we would sell such technology to. And these principles are really quite simple. They speak to transparency, ensuring that the AI systems that we develop are understandable, that as was shared previously, that there's transparency on what that information will be used for, and also at the point of collection that data subjects are notified that data is being collected and would be used for such purposes. There's a principle around fairness, ensuring that AI systems should treat all people fairly. So we're trying to build in tools that can support reducing bias. I won't say eliminating bias because I'm not quite sure that it's something that's quite possible. The other principle is around inclusiveness, and this also speaks to the ensuring that the data is representative of the populace that we're intending to support with whatever this tool is or whatever the outcome is, that the systems are reliable and safe, and also that they have privacy and security at the heart. So this speaks a little bit to the privacy by design or privacy by default conversations, which are things that are actually mandated by some regulations. And then the last principle is around accountability. And this speaks to having a human in the loop, or at least the ability to have human oversight over whatever outcomes the AI systems are programmed to achieve. The complexity with this is that these are principles that we as a technology provider are subscribing to. We're also cascading these through our ecosystem. So we have guidelines that we provide to developers who are building use cases on our platform, but it becomes difficult to police third parties in this instance. And that's really where the support of whether legal regulation or institutional design or penalties, as was being shared earlier, would really support to ensure that this is occurring across the ecosystem.
Thank you for that, Tilia. I think it's good to hear, and we worked on a number of kind of presentations and so on, and what's been quite clear is that as a subject matter and this may align with, you know, being in inverted commas a kind of mature company that has gone through its own issues over time and has kind of reflected on the position of technology and some of the safeguards, the deeper safeguards that need to be, as you said, by design and default. I think that's a really, I know it's a concept built in GDPR and so on and so forth, but having that as sensitizing business operation to kind of really entrench that way of thinking, it's going to be all important. But let me stop there and introduce somebody I know very well, Anjawala. Mr. Karim Anjawala, Managing Partner of ANK, their friend and colleague. Can I please introduce you to take us on the journey that you want to explain to us?
Thank you, Femi, and hello, everyone. It's a real honor and privilege to be here. I want to sort of go a few hundred years back and remind everyone that, you know, the first agent of globalization were ships, you know, mass globalization. And then, you know, obviously over time, ships, and then there were airlines. And around ships and airlines, we developed a form of global regulation, which enabled airlines and ships everywhere in the world to sail and fly under specified norms. And then around that, global norms were developed around the rules on immigration, on the sale of goods, on letters of credit to support transactions, and on banking and insurance laws. And I think that what COVID-19 has shown us is that in the world of data, which is, you know, the most globalizing agent, if you like, the glue of globalization now, in our new world, much more important than ships and aeroplanes and immigration, we're still in the Wild West. And Ottilia confirming really that in many places Microsoft has to articulate their own very commendable principles is a reflection of that reality. Putting an African context on this, I think it's important that one accepts that whilst robbery is a bad thing, one has to take steps to avoid being robbed. And a survey of African countries demonstrates that only about 20 have data protection legislation out of 54. And in many of those countries, that data protection legislation, as in Kenya, is brand new. There are also problems, of course, globally, because even within the EU, there is a disagreement, say, between the position taken by France, Germany, and the UK on whether data is property at all. The UK takes a very different position from that in France, and in Germany, they take yet a different position. But most recently, in a very interesting case concerning the German intelligence agencies, the German courts, pursuant to a constitutional complaint on surveillance of foreigners in other jurisdictions by the BND, the German intelligence agency, was very clear on the principles that needed to be followed, and in fact held the act enacted in Germany to be anti-constitutional because they believed there were insufficient safeguards and that the principle of proportionality had not been followed. The German courts also in that case, and this is a lesson I think for us globally, held that it was necessary when it's not easy to notify the movement or need to access data for there to be, and therefore you don't have the normal judicial safeguards for the use of data. It's important that there be an independent and independently funded oversight mechanism that regulates the use of data. I think in that is a lesson for African countries, and in fact for the world, but particularly for Africa, where we have for long now not valued some of our most important intangible assets, be they biological, cultural, or in this case, our data assets. There's a lesson in that there is now an urgent need for a regulatory regime that is transnational in nature and which secures data. Of course, the deconstruction of globalization that we are seeing across the world makes this an even more difficult task because, by definition, agreeing the rules of the road for a transnational regime on data protection and data security requires international cooperation. So I am not, of course, optimistic that in the short term such a regime will easily come to pass. I think I'll stop there, Femi. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm particularly struck by not just the historical kind of backdrop and seeing how that has coalesced, if you like, to represent the old world, but the idea that frameworks, how we frame and how we protect our integrity, it's within Africa, of course, and we've got serious developments that have occurred with the African Free Continental Trade Area and so on, and which is going to be an important vehicle. But I think this session is about the frameworks. What frameworks? What will they look like? and how will they be developed. So I think that we certainly will be taking that subject further, because it is critical to unpacking this particular issue on ethics. Now, I do have a speaking slot in this, but I'm going to be very brief, because obviously I'm doing some moderating as well. I'll turn on my camera now. I'm not sure how I look, so I do apologize. It's been quite an interesting evening. What I really wanted to kind of bring home is oftentimes the Africa experience, if I can put it that way, has been very much on the periphery, particularly in the last few centuries, and we all know about the kind of histories of struggle and histories of we don't necessarily need to go into it. But what's important from my perspective is how do we come to look at the systems that are embedded across Africa in our various cultures, that actually, when we unpack them, seem to display a form of genius, but a solutions that oftentimes are overlooked for other reasons. And so we can, for example, look at agricultural techniques. Some of the ancient techniques that have been deployed in Africa, to this day, if they were deployed, would deal with many of the issues of agricultural production deficits and so on. If we look at the issue of the rule of law, and this, of course, this panel is very much focused on that in many ways. Our systems of justice at the, in inverted commas again, localized level has much to say about itself, but at the same time, it somehow plays second fiddle to the, if you like, the elaborate or official system. And one can look at the COVID situation to a certain extent and say, well, there are semblances of this same strand, and we can't be sure, and nobody can be complacent about what has happened. But it's very clear that Africa is not being hit as hard as the rest of the world in respect of the number of people affected, adversely affected, if I put it that way. And then one can ask, why not? And could it be that, well, in fact, the way in which communities are oriented, very much people and people driven, very much circular in terms of information strands and so on and so forth, has somehow insulated the spread. I was talking to a person the other day who's in Nairobi, but has had to go to the village, and they were saying, well, within the village, people actually, they know where the danger spots are because of the levels of communication that we have within the community. The surveillance issues, okay, not necessarily technological surveillance, but the human technology, if you like, the human technology and surveillance that is at play has had clearly some serious impact. And so my kind of trying to kind of understand and unpack and say about inputs into technology at that cellular level, at the kind of algorithmic level, is where is all that information, where is all that, if you like, technology, and how is it filtering in to how we design things? I know we've discussed some of this today, but I think it's critical that sometimes we miss the most genius of simplicity in how we can inform how we go forward. So that's one point. And I suppose the second point is really about the ethical basis upon which we will be framing over time how we go about dealing with issues such as the data privacy and so on and so forth. And of course, we have the globalized UN-based human rights paradigm, which in my practice as a lawyer for many years was the epicenter of what I did, and it's all important. But what tends to happen is that it's reflective in lots of ways of a Western philosophical basis, and African or Asian systems of ethics are not necessarily, I'm not saying they're not there, because those at that level they're universal, one could argue, But the ethical basis, for example, of a system like Ubuntu, which and the similar types of systems around Africa, which focus on the central tenet that I am because you exist, I think is very powerful. It's something that underpins African culture at its best. Of course, we don't always see it at its best, but as an underpinning. And I think that when we come to look at frameworks, that such ethical bases need to also be center stage. It would be, in my view and many others, somehow diminished for a paradigm that's really going to take off. And I mean, I think we all agree it's going to take off exponentially, a bit like this virus potentially. And so therefore, what oversees this needs to be as robust as it possibly can be. So inclusion. And I can't comment on my own presentation. So if somebody wants to take over just for this part, I'd be very grateful.
Femi, just before I pass on, you pass on to the next speaker, I just want to pass a message on to you. I think the problem with Professor Franceschi may be that he's got his invitation to the wrong email. He may need it to the Commonwealth email. If you could just attend to that, please, as we pass on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Karim. Can I just, Karim, if you don't mind, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot, could you take over for a moment so that I can actually go and deal with this properly? Yeah, I'll kind of leave for just one moment. Thank you.
Thanks. Susan, can you hear us well? Professor?
Yes, I can hear you beautifully.
Wonderful. And is Professor Oguge on the line? I'm just making sure.
I don't think so.
Right. Okay. So why don't you respond, Susan?
But we do have Ryan, I believe.
Ryan is on the line, is he? Great. Okay, so Ryan can go up after you.
Okay, great. So I just want to take you through a few points that elaborate a little bit on what Louise said in the very first session, and Charles has said in this section, and Femi just now, to open us up for our deep dive on ethics and human rights in a few days. So my argument tonight is that we should think of human rights workers as essential workers as well, and start designing some of these health responses with that in mind. So at the moment, we are purely directing our thoughts towards what will deal with the pandemic. But my argument tonight is that COVID-19 is posing an existential threat to human rights activists as well worldwide. There's increasing evidence that authorities are using the pandemic as an excuse to increase repression, revoke rights, and in many cases diminish equality. So I know while all our eyes are drawn to solving a particular problem, I want us to contextualise that with this idea that civil society space has closed literally for many people around the world. So I do a lot of work on human rights defenders, for example. So that means you have the UN responding in certain ways. A group of the human rights experts said in March that emergency declarations based on the outbreak should not be used as a basis to target particular groups, minorities or individuals. It should not function as a cover for repressive action under the guise of protecting health, and it should not be used simply to quash dissent. So this goes to what Charles says, that you could have measures that have the unintended consequence of breaching human rights in particular ways, or you can have measures that can be used as a cover for repressive action. We have seen that happening. We have seen sweeping restrictions on freedom of movement and association that can mask targeting of certain human rights defenders, and we've seen that in China and Hong Kong. We've seen it in relation to the release of some prisoners but not others in various places. We've seen reversals of reproductive rights and personal safety of women. rushing through laws that they would not normally rush through. And we know from the UNFPA, for example, that the pandemic's had terrible consequences for reproductive rights. And of course, we know that pandemic responses generally that involved lockdown in place has had a really terrible impact on intimate partner and family violence globally as well. So I'm basically urging us to think of this issue of data surveillance in a broader context of general human rights considerations, and try to choose techniques and data design that lessens the chance of human rights activity being curtailed. So this is particularly important when we think about vulnerable people in closed facilities. So I think prisons, refugee camps, aged care, mental health institutions, places that already have extremely high levels of surveillance. So to help us through this discussion, I'm using 8 factors that I've drawn from a joint civil society statement on the 2nd of April from over 100 human rights organisations, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, many African civil society organisations, many civil society organisations in all around the world, including Australia. So basically, the point is that technology can and should play a role in saving lives and spreading public health messages, increasing access to healthcare, as Charles has mentioned. So there's no human rights problem with using technology. In fact, it's probably a good thing. But we know that state digital surveillance powers, such as obtaining access to mobile phone location data, can threaten privacy, freedom of expression and freedom of association. And we know that because of these measures being used in a counter-terrorism and countering violent extremism context previously. So the 2 consequences of that are that we could degrade trust in public authorities, which is incredibly important for the effectiveness of public health responses, and also that we could discriminate further and disproportionately harm already marginalised communities. So, for example, technology can alert authorities about people's movements, but could also potentially be hacked and used to track partners as a type of coercive control in domestic violence situations. So the 8 factors, very briefly. Surveillance measures must be lawful, necessary and proportionate. This is a basic human rights requirement of any law. So they have to be transparent, they have to be determined by the appropriate authority, they have to be proportionate. So this is what Attilia was speaking about, this idea of there should be some sort of transparent legislative measures. This also increases contestability. And this is particularly important because many of our parliaments around the world are not sitting or sitting in limited manners. So if governments do expand monitoring and surveillance powers, they should be time bound and have sunset clauses. So basically indefinite surveillance is definitely not compatible with human rights because it so affects freedom of association. It must be limited in scope and not be used for commercial purposes. So this is about privacy rights. So this is an opportunity, I think, around the world for the COVID pandemic to lead to an increase in stronger privacy legislation. So probably the EU data protection regulation is the strongest we have, but in many other countries in the world, privacy protections are extremely weak. The 4th principle, that governments must protect people's data. So this, I think there was a question in the chat about what about being hacked. So in this case, when states say that data is anonymous or depersonalised, that must be real. There must be information about how it's been anonymised. So we can't allow any compromise of people's digital safety through these techniques. Number 5 relates to big data and artificial intelligence, which was dealt with in the previous panel. So myself and others write about the fact that these big data sets often have wired in prejudice from the designers, basically, and racial or gender bias in particular. And so we have to make sure that marginalised populations' lives are not obscured or misrepresented in large data sets. So this goes to the inequality issue that's been raised previously. Number 6, if governments enter into data sharing agreements with private sector entities, they must be based on law and they must be disclosed. So this relates to, and they must not be commercialised, as I said. So this relates to Microsoft's role, for example. Third parties are having to or must also comply with human rights where possible, and in many cases it's really very standards based or not legislated. Number 7 is around accountability protections. So this is about not sharing health information with security and intelligence agencies, which has been the predilection of many governments around the world. And as Attilia said, you need to be able to challenge any COVID data that's used on you. So this is the human rights principle of effective remedies. You should be able to have an effective remedy if your data is misused. And finally, you should keep people in the loop, as Attilia said. So there should be the ability for stakeholders like public health sector professionals, but also marginalised population groups to have a say. So I will leave it there.
I'm very glad to see that Professor Louis Franceschi is on. Welcome. We apologize. We have Microsoft on the panel, so we can put our complaints. But welcome, and please do take over.
No, don't worry. I am the one who is sorry, because there was a confusion with the email address between the Commonwealth and Gmail. And I discovered that time is relative. As a friend of mine says, it all depends on which side of the bathroom door you are. In this case, I was on this side, minutes were passing, and I was getting so concerned. Apologies for taking this long, but anyway, thank God the technical hitch has been resolved. And certainly,
Prof,
I'm sorry, Professor, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah. Did you hear what I said before? Yeah, hopefully.
No.
Well, I heard a little bit about Charles' presentation, but very little, sadly. I heard something from Susan and from Karim, but let's not get stopped and stuck because of me. The technical hitch has been resolved, and I would like now to just invite Ryan from University of Cape Town to give you a response, and then that will also give me time to catch up with the very many ideas that I can see in the chat. Thank you. Ryan, the floor is yours.
Hi, can you hear me, Professor?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you, and thank you to the speakers before me who raised a number of interesting ethical concerns with relation to the issues under discussion. I suppose my response would be, and this is partly addressed by the 8 points that Susan mentioned, related to the different kinds of ethical dilemmas that we face, especially in the accelerated program that COVID has forced upon us. So there are in my view, two kinds of ethical concerns. The one ethical concern is the ethical concern from within, and this was discussed to a certain extent by the previous panel. So algorithmic biases, which Susan mentioned as well. Some deep learning programs inherently, through two different mechanisms, one is related to training sample bias. So for instance, when speech recognition training software is designed and trained on male voices, it has trouble picking up female voices. And as speakers in the previous track mentioned, also facial recognition software has these issues too. And then there are feature linking biases that actually are a little bit more subtle in how they can discriminate against people. And so those are the ethical concerns that I think the technology itself brings forth. And we need a set of guidelines and policies and regulations to be able to deal with those. And I think it's a separate, to a large extent, issue from the issues of what we do with that data. So this is where regulations on time stamping government regulations and policies comes in, so that after periods of crises like this one, we don't have continued infringement on people's personal privacy. But to a large extent, although they seem to center around a similar set of questions, ethically speaking, it seems like we're dealing with two separate entities. The one is related to the philosophical debate and the ethical debate about the nature of the technology itself, so-called black boxing or epistemic opacity in deep learning, where there are lots of things we just don't understand about the technology, and the results, even the predictions, as much as they were endorsed in the previous track, which obviously would be the future of both for the fourth industrial revolution and the fifth industrial revolution. We need to keep track of the biases that are being generated. And then the next level, the sort of governance issues and the ethical issues, are more the human level, where we need to regulate whether or not third-party multinational organizations or governments themselves can manipulate the data and store it and use it for nefarious means. So keeping those two things in mind, I wonder if some of the speakers can address whether they do agree that there is a separation between these two ethical dimensions, or if perhaps some sort of regulation can address both of them in some sort of way. Most of my concerns as a researcher have been on the side of the ethical issues within the technology itself. But I think Femi brought up interesting points about Africa, because in Africa we have this unique position perhaps where we can see both of these kinds of ethical dimensions playing themselves out simultaneously. So not only as Africans do we have to worry about data that's been trained on outside of Africa data sets, for instance, and their application, which in certain cases, I mean, we have studies which involve medical predictions being different for white people of a certain privilege in the USA, for instance, and African Americans, where the AI would actually suggest that less medical treatment is relevant for African American communities. So, I mean, these are the kinds of issues that we need to grapple with. And I suppose the question at the end of the day is whether we need to divide and conquer and treat them completely differently as different dimensions, or if there's a unified strategy that can address the general worry about ethics and AI and implementation in a way that looks at the problems from within and the problems from the top down, so to speak. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Ryan. Perhaps here, and the audience will forgive me because in this going in and out of the room, the chat room, I missed quite a bit of the discussion. But the last question you asked, Ryan, is directly pointing at Professor Charles Sanford, that is the ethical dilemma, the use of the information we are collecting. Charles, what are the limits, if I may ask? Sorry, I ask here for guidance from the organizers, if there is anybody who still needs to speak, or there is no one. Brian, after you, there is nobody else, right? Just in case I missed.
No, there's nobody else that is available.
Okay. Thank you. Excellent. So, Charles, what are the limits that could determine the ethical use of data collected, and how do you enforce those limits?
Well, actually, first things I just want to come back that what Ryan was saying, that drawing attention to those two different kinds of ethical dilemmas, I think is a very good point. That they're not completely separated, I would argue, because in some sense to the extent that the data may be unreliable or biased in the ways you talk, and I very much acknowledge that, because there are some programs which actually predict what the damages would be in various kinds of cases, and that's supposed to be a guide to the lawyers who are negotiating with each other. This is a very real problem in some US bases, but if in fact the existing database of settlements is itself biased because of the bias of judges. It's a classic example where it builds in. And I think that you'll make a very important point that often we won't know where those biases are. I mean, we may have biased human beings, but the thing is we look at that bias judge and we try to do something about it. But the thing is that some of the biases may be built in and we don't recognise them, and we can say, oh, isn't it wonderful, there's data, and that's the answer. Whereas I think that the dilemmas, the bias issues are very important. The two of them are to some extent related, because if some of the data is likely to be biased, then obviously it makes greater, we've got to be that much more careful in how we use it. So the human use depends upon it. And I think that although there's another point, is that when you are looking at the potential of bias in the data and the potential of bias you don't even recognise, it requires a degree of caution, and that's probably also a reason for sort of put in the sceptical, querying human being in there. And the thing is that I think sometimes it comes out of a computer, it must be right. Everything from these big data to if you see a printed page, you are much less likely to pick up grammatical errors in it than if it's actually handwriting, because it just looks that much better. Now, sorry, the thing is, I wanted to answer those important points by Ryan. Now, you're asking me what are the limits on the use. I think I was trying to say in that there's that one doesn't look for a single silver bullet, one doesn't look for a single mechanism. One needs to look at a mixture of measures. Legal, ethical certainly tells you what you should be doing, legal, economic, institutional, and at multiple levels, from international down to regional, national, subnational, corporate and professional. There is no single way to ensure that the data is used ethically. One needs to have a mixture of mutually reinforcing mechanisms. It's what we call an integrity system, and I think you need an integrity system for the use of data, just like you do for many other valuable things that government has.
Excellent, thank you, Charles. Now, if I may, I would like to now address a question to Karim, if I'm allowed. I don't know if I'm jumping the protocols, but certainly since I came late, I am forgiven. But Karim, it's something that I was asked a few days ago to give a little bit of an idea of how sensitive what's going on is in regards to ethics, data management, surveillance, etc. And I mentioned the case of Edward Snowden. It happened less than, 7 years ago, when Edward Snowden, working for the National Security Agency of the United States, released 300,000 secret files on people who were under surveillance, who did not know it, and the surveillance seems to be intrusive. You mentioned a decision by the German Federal Constitutional Court last week, or late last week, when the court decided that any person, even foreigners, being investigated outside Germany have to follow a specific pattern, regulated pattern that respects human rights, which is a point Susan was bringing up very well in her talk. How can we get the genie back into the bottle? I mean, we are now with a pandemic where our physical space has reduced to a bare minimum. Anything we do work-wise, I was just now chairing a meeting of 54 member countries of the Commonwealth. We did not reach an agreement yet They are difficult people. No, but anyway, it's normal. This happens. You have to work things properly, but everything is being done virtual. I was telling them that I'm already getting Skype sophrenia or Zoom suction because we are all the time in Zoom, in Skype, etc. So how can we put the genie back into the bottle at a time when things are so delicate and surveillance may be so huge and so invasive because we are doing everything through the computers? What is your take on that regard?
Thanks, Professor Franceschi. I think it's a very real problem because fear is the greatest motivator for individuals to share data. Right now, whether that's fear of a terrorist attack, fear of ill health caused by a pandemic, as individuals, we come to the conclusion that it's in our interest to share data. And of course, there are obvious reasons, and Charles mentioned this in his opening remarks, as to the public interest in sharing data, okay, and allowing for the tracking of movements and so on and so forth. I think the very real risk, though, is what happens in two respects. Firstly, how easy is it for governments and regulators to now false flag other risks in the future to heighten the fear factor and continue, therefore, the surveillance techniques that have been developed during COVID? I think we can never underestimate that. And a previous panel talked about false news and fake news and how to out it. And I think the combination of these things is very important because, before we know it, we'll move from COVID-19 to COVID something else. But we don't know whether the next COVID is really a COVID, as bad as this COVID, right? So I think this is a very real problem. And in my experience, generally, these boundaries, it's a bit like taxation, once the rates go up, they almost never come down. Okay, I think it's a bit like this when you are pressing the boundaries of data and surveillance. So putting the genie back in the bottle is no mean task. And I think, having said that, I think the German decision is really quite outstanding in its scope, in its reach, and in the extent to which it is forcing the intelligence agencies in Germany to think again. Okay, and when you mentioned Snowden, I immediately reflected on the fact that had the German decision been an American one, what happened in, of course, we talk about Snowden, but it was really about the NSA's illegal tapping. That was a real issue. Okay? I think the outcome would have been very different. In the German decision, they uphold the rights for strategic surveillance, for international cooperation, but they talk about proportionality, right? And they have a number of tests which they say that must be met in order for this principle. So it's about the volume, the duration, the specificity. It can't just be it can't be a data dump, right? It has to be a specific purpose for which you're following this data. And a bunch of other public interest kind of safeguards that would mean that it would be quite hard for the German intelligence agencies to now cross the boundary in the way that the NSA did. So I guess sorry, just one final point. I think we are how can I say this? We are lambs to the slaughter because of the utility of the products that the big data companies give us. Somebody was complaining to me about the fact that Google Maps knows where they are, and I asked them, well, why do you use it? So they said, well, around, right? And that's really the issue, right? So you can't. It's a two-way street. If you are going to use the product, with pinpoint accuracy tell you where to go, but the product will know where you are. It has to know where you are, right? So it's complicated. I think we as human beings are too willing to sacrifice our rights to our own data, and until there's a paradigm shift about that, I think the genie may not go back into the bottle that easily.
If I may, I think that's a really good point. I mean, that somebody commented that George Orwell got 1984 wrong, because the thing is that we're all buying the TV and carrying it around with us. But I think that this is a delicate balance. I did wonder whether there might be some potential case for optimism, not blind optimism, in that it was interesting the Australian government was so desperate for us to download this app. It doesn't work, of course, but and I don't think they're clever enough to be involved in a conspiracy to get us to download an app that doesn't work for COVID but work for something else. But in one sense, they were so, in our country at least, they were so desperate to get us to do it that I was actually wondering if they would need to. There's a lot of scepticism among Australians for downloading it, even though 6 million did, and a hell of a lot didn't. And we've had experience with not complying with these things for concern about how it might be misused. That I almost wondered whether the government, which was desperate to open up the economy and said that downloading this app was vital, whether they come up with a series of protections for the COVID app, which would be very effective in preventing abuses of other kinds. Maybe that's too optimistic, but in a sense, if the government really wants something and it needs to, in order to get it through Parliament, has to actually provide some safeguards, it might be a precedent elsewhere. But again, of course, this won't just happen. It's something that might happen if we really push for it and say, you want this app? Okay, you've got to have credible protections, and why not have credible protections in other forms of data mining?
Now, this takes me to a very touchy issue. Google finality contracts. I mean, those type of contracts that is you take it or leave it. Yet they have you could say the monopoly of search engines, so you can't leave it. In this case, and this is a question I ask you, Charles, and Susan as well, how would you deal, for example, in Europe, Google would actually lose a court case, and they have lost several times if they are taken to in these circumstances. In the US, they are protected. But what do you think, Charles, how can these realities that are no longer territorial can be dealt with? I mean, when we are talking of Google, Microsoft, all these big corporations that are handling megadata, I mean, Facebook and name it, we are talking of a reality that is no longer territorial and cannot be regulated by one because data cross borders like disease. I mean, we are talking of a virtual pandemic, sort of a good pandemic, but how do you can handle this? And then I ask Susan to be on standby to tell us about that balance between national security and human rights, specifically in relation to the surveillance and the abuses that are committed of intrusion against human rights defenders. So, Charles, you have the floor or the screen, and then we will let Susan tell us later.
And sorry, just before you jump in, Charles, I'm just going to warn us that we're probably going to run out of time. So we're going to have to kind of make it as brief as it, because our session ends at 7:30.
The first thing is that even even if this is a global matter, Google and Facebook want to be able to get revenue from people in countries, and that's important. Firstly, paying tax on their profits is one of the first things they can do, but money is taken from bank accounts in Australia to go to the Bahamas or Netherlands or wherever else. Now, the thing is that we say, no, they will not be transferred unless A, you pay tax on it, and B, the thing is that you actually have, you cease abusing your market power. And that's the other thing, you can still give fines for abuse of market power. And boy, there's a lot of market power, and funnily enough, with that market power goes abuse. So actually get them where it hurts. The thing is that they can't, none of that money is transferred out of our accounts to Google unless they actually comply with the requirements of our laws, including our courts, with abuse of power and with unequal contracts. That's a
fantastic. Susan.
So very briefly, in relation to the big social media companies, they have, and Google, they have a duty to make sure that fake news or false information is not spread, even where the algorithm might say that it's a credible source. So I've been heartened to see that Google is trying to direct people towards the World Health Organization, as opposed to other sources. But, you know, Facebook has some real issues with its moderation around these things. And we've seen the incite responses against, say, Chinese people all over the world. We've seen a lot of Asian, we've seen completely wrong-headed ideas that certain minority groups are spreading the virus, for example, around Southeast Asia. So, you know, this idea of technology also spread discrimination, can spread hate speech very easily, and can spread fake news and disinformation. And this pandemic has been with disinformation. It's been one of those key issues where to trust sources of authority in order to modify their behaviour to stay safe. And what you've seen, I think, in the countries that have been successful is a high level of trust in the information sources. And where that hasn't occurred, including in places like America, you've had this terrible situation. So that is another human rights aspect to this issue, and affects technology companies in particular.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Susan. Light has been shed. I think we could keep going here for hours and hours. I had Femi 7:30. Here in London it's 5:30, so we have 2 hours to go.
30 a.m. here tomorrow.
Imagine. Ask Femi, tell us something quickly. Something very interesting happening in Africa. We had never, and we, because I'm from Kenya, we had never been so much looking at the. We usually looked at Europe, US, whenever we saw innovation or anything or anything to do with relations, to the point that here 15 years ago, until Kenya Airways, Ethiopian Airways, and Rwanda Air came into play, to travel from Nairobi to perhaps even by going to Belgium and then back. The AFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, has come into place. How do you see this playing a role within the virtual development of Africa and vis-a-vis COVID-19, what is going with the pandemics? You are in a very sensitive that is Tanzania. Let's not get into that, but tell us some, perhaps 2 or 3 punchlines in regards to how this can play a role or not in regards to all this revolution.
I'm really glad you brought this up, because I think it's important the African Free Continental Trade Agreement is massive for the continent. This is stuff that's been talked about from independence, you know, main Nkrumahs of the world and so on and so forth have been propagating together as a unit and really tackling things and seeing strength in numbers. And we talk about that in business, we talk about that in it relates to the continent as well, very, very clearly. So it's at the moment, there's a lot to do and there's lots of discussions going on to be worked out in terms of the regulatory frameworks and so on and so on. But what's exciting about it from my perspective is that on so many fronts, economically, in terms of employment, education, it's really a focus point. And when you think of technology and you think what individualized countries have done, so you know, Kenya, and somebody already mentioned M-Pesa, to connect the continent up now in this kind of really democratize finance, well, in the kind of sense, to reach areas of communities in a much more dynamic way. But also the important thing here is also building what is already in existence. So that when I mentioned earlier that circular communities, that's why M-Pesa, that's response, I believe, good, that's the thing, good and bad, is able to root that much more effectively. That bodes well for how we could develop a lot in terms of trade and so on. But it's first that reference and to popularize that symbolic reference so that, you know, this is not just from the top. This youth levels, the gender, so on, recognize this as a moment to coalesce around and strong. That can also, and that's what's happening. I can't say this with certainty, but clearly what's happening is that Susan mentioned the voice of authority at this moment. I think the voice of authority in Africa is through the community. Community is saying, look, there are issues here. Listen forward within paradigm. So I think that it's an exciting time. And on that note, I think we're going to have to leave before we get kicked out because I think it's time barred. I want to quickly say, please try and wrap up before we're kicked out of this session because I think the timing will give us down.
Oh, very good. I was going to, but anyway, I will not. We are time bar. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a fantastic pleasure to. Sadly, I miss a little bit of the interaction. I think there is much for reflection and for conversation for days. I would encourage ALN to keep this going. Partners, very many issues that have popped up here and there regarding contracts, big data, contact tracing apps, bio insertions. There are very many topics perhaps we did not cover as we would have wanted to. All the issues related, well, in relation to democracy and governance, there is a huge scare that democracies have failed to control the pandemic vis-a-vis authoritarian governments, which is but it may be actually one of the trade-off you make when you grant freedoms, genuine freedoms to people. Well, your food for thought. Thank you very much here. Charles, Susan, Karim, Femian, all of you, those who could join us, like Otilia, well, I hope this is being recorded.
She made it, by the way. She's here. She's gone.
Fantastic. Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I know you totally. Anyway, it has been a great pleasure. And please, ALN, let's do this again. Keep the and we are all at home. So we want to continue this going. Thanks a lot.
Much, Louis. Can I, before you all go, can I just say, and this is, this is a conversation that has started. There's going to be much more live sessions. Our subsequent, they will keep looking at question 1 this time, and then we will proceed on a weekly basis thereafter to at least discuss so far and enriched even further. And we had give a kind of punchline, but in fact, Professor Louis has done it in his summing up. We will, of course, to everyone who's been in attendance, wonderful kind of summarizing this learning experience and getting used to technology in this. So we will be more refined. Atelier's team will definitely help us next time round. Thank you all so much. It's really been fantastic. There have been challenges, but they've been really, really. Thank you all. God bless.
Thank you.
Bye.